When I first started playing Elden Ring, I thought of it as Dark Souls, Breath of the Wild. Souls were now called runes, bonfires were sites of grace, but it was ultimately just a fancy next-gen update with a bunch of arbitrary terminology and surreal imagery. Nothing embodied the surreal imagery better than the two fingers, which were originally told our sage advisors speaking on behalf of the greater will. But then we see them. Giant, hairy, literal fingers, twitching almost imperceptibly as an old woman beckons us to enter the room and hear their wisdom. The standard dismissive line among my friends at the time, whenever we encountered something sufficiently creepy and strange in the game, was, well, George R.R. Martin must have written that part. But the image of the fingers stuck in my head as I continued playing. There was a feeling of inscrutable intent behind them. These things were too deliberate, too uncannily alien, yet familiar to just be a surreal image. And as I continued playing, I became convinced that Elden Ring had a real, meaningful storyline hidden inside of it, which meant there was a reason why the envoys of the Greater Will were fingers. There was a reason why the glimmering golden resources I used to level up were called runes. And there was a reason why Queen Marika had been chosen to become a god, and yet had shattered the Elden Ring and fractured reality. I knew that there was a real artistic vision behind the game, but I couldn't see what it was. Now I can. I can see how the most important aspects of Elden Ring's world can weave together to form a greater whole. So I'm going to do something unorthodox. Rather than a lore video that narrows in on a specific topic, I'm going to zoom out and connect the major threads of lore to craft a complete interpretation of one of the most enigmatic storylines in gaming history. Come with me, and let's discuss the grand, unified theory of Elden Ring. But first, some preamble. Despite the bombastic title, my goal is not to arrive at the unassailable truth of Elden Ring, but to find connections that will allow us, with moderate speculation, to pull together a deeper understanding of the lore. If you're new to Elden Ring lore, I strongly recommend creators like VatiVidya and Smotown that carefully and deliberately go through what we know as a player community. Instead, I'm going to take all these established data points as a basis upon which to build an interpretation. Needless to say, that means extensive spoilers for Elden Ring. But I suspect you knew that. If it feels like I'm going off the deep end at some point, well, maybe I am. But I'm choosing the points to speculate about with purpose. The goal is for each bit of speculation to pay dividends as a tool to enrich our interpretation and allow us to answer questions that often get left unanswered. So let's begin with a question I asked myself in the first few minutes of the game. What are runes? As you play Elden Ring, you collect runes from every enemy you defeat, and once you meet Melina, you can use those runes to level up, increasing your strength or dexterity or intelligence. But this terminology never made sense to me. In our world, runes are essentially letters, fragments of words. How do you turn runes into strength? The meaning of these words in the Bible is a subject for theologians to debate, but some authors have made them quite literal in the context of their own worlds. In the world of Earthsea, by Ursula K. Le Guin, all of creation is made out of words, and magic is done by learning the true name of a thing. That is, its name in the world-making language. Dragons can speak the language of creation natively in Earthsea, so they can breathe fire simply by opening their mouth and saying the word fire. This is also how the dragon speech in Skyrim functions, and the Kingkiller Chronicles and other fantasy series make use of the idea of true names. It's easy to see why the idea of a world made out of words is so appealing to a fantasy author. Not only is it poetic, but in a sense it's true. Earthsea actually is a world made entirely out of words. There's a meta-narrative harmony in a story like this. So what does this have to do with Elden Ring? Well, the biblical influence on Elden Ring is pretty clear when we look at the image of Marika crucified upon a rune arc. But there's something deeper at work here. I think runes are fragments of the language of creation. They are words. Words that impart upon a body knowledge of how to be alive. Instructions for life. Perhaps the words that bind a soul and body together. For that matter, we do have instructions for life built into our bodies in the real world, in the form of DNA, which is its own kind of language. If this is right, if runes are a kind of primordial, life-giving language, it explains why they can be found in every living thing in the lands between. And it even makes sense that collecting more runes can make it possible to update the rules of your body to become stronger, faster, or smarter. But what kind of language are we talking about? Consider the swirling, almost dance-like script visible in an item like the Cypherpata. This same swirling script is visible within the Elden Ring itself, if you view it in sufficiently high resolution. Consider that the messengers of the Greater Will are voiceless fingers, and that the person who seems to understand the Golden Order better than anyone else, the noble Gold Mask, never speaks, but only communicates with subtle motions of his body. The language of creation, it seems, is a form of sign language. It is shape and motion itself. As such, spoken words will only ever be able to approximate the deepest truths of the world, which are expressed through motion, through action. This is a fitting underlying reality for a world set within a video game, for an experience that you can only appreciate by playing it. In fact, this is an allegory quite similar to the fantasy world made of words, because meta-narratively, the world of Elden Ring quite literally was made by the motion of fingers. Thousands of fingers tapping out an impossibly complex pattern onto keyboards and making arcane gestures with computer mice. As players, we also interact with the world of Elden Ring using our fingers. So the idea that people inside this world can only understand the distant, mysterious intentions of outer beings by interpreting the motion of fingers is an uncannily organic metaphor for the actual relationship between us as players and the character we control. We even have characters like Ranni express resentment about her lack of free will, as her destiny is controlled by the fingers. There's a lot more I can say about the thematic relevance of the fingers, but I'll save that for later. For now, it suffices to say that, like most people, my initial reaction to the two fingers was repulsion, and mild shock at how literal their title was. But now, the more I think about it, the more strangely interesting I think this design choice is. This can tell us even more about the world, though. If the language of creation is a kind of sign language, then it implies this is a world in which a shape or a motion that represents some aspect of reality invokes that aspect on a deep level. This seems to be intrinsic to the nature of magic in Elden Ring, as all spells show a visual crest or symbol related to the kind of magic invoked when cast. In such a world, monumental architecture is also more than just symbolic, as visual symbolism itself has metaphysical significance. This might also explain the significance of eyes as a connection to the divine, because eyes can perceive this golden language when ears cannot. Notably, the most ear-themed character in the game is Gideon, the All-Knowing, and his reliance on word of mouth, on indirectly gathering facts, as symbolized by the ear-shaped ornamentation on his armor, may represent the idea that Gideon, despite knowing many facts, lacks true wisdom. You might be wondering, well, how do you pick up something as abstract as a word and put it in your inventory? And this, I think, is where the concept of gold comes in. We constantly hear about the golden order in the game and the grace of gold, so it's easy to see all this as colorful phrases for the same thing, the current order of the world. But then we get descriptions like the Minor Erdtree incantation, which says it contains the kindness of gold without order. So apparently gold and order are separate things, and the golden order is made of their union. I have a long version of this, but the short version is that I think gold is an underlying force of life, and it's capable of manifesting runes as golden runes, as a tangible thing you can pick up, and which can be used to heal or nourish a person. This golden manifestation is a memory of the language of shape and motion being expressed, like all recorded languages. And there's definitely a thematic connection between gold and memory. Also note that when you pick up golden runes, they're always inside of a body, even if it's a dead body. Somehow, a body being a vessel for runes is important. In any case, we can understand why the golden blessings of the Erdtree would be so revered by the people of the lands between, if it allows them to interact with the language of life itself and use that to heal or strengthen people. In summary, runes are literal words. They are the instructions for life, the rules for a living thing, and golden fragments of this language can be collected after something dies. Okay, so then what are great runes? Great runes are the primary object of our journey. They are initially described to us as shards of the Elden Ring, and we are told that if we can collect enough of them, we can use them to reforge the Elden Ring and repair the world. The Elden Ring itself is essentially a set of rules for all of reality to follow. So naturally, the great runes that make it up seem to be those various rules and principles, individually. Normal runes are rules for a single living thing. Great runes are the rules for multiple living things. However, the great runes are more than just pieces of a whole. They clearly have power on their own, as the opening cinematic tells us that the great runes granted each of the demigods newfound power that led to a great civil war, the Shattering. We can deduce some of these newfound powers by implication. For example, Radahn appears to be a large person before the Shattering, but when we encounter him, he's absolutely enormous, and his size seems to reflect his connection to the powers of gravity, which he uses to hold back meteors, and to ride his comically undersized horse. Mikola, another shard-bearer, is said to have always been a charming person, but his ability to magically charm and compel many people at once is shown to be connected to his Great Rune, because the charm breaks when his Great Rune shatters in the DLC. Melania, meanwhile, was said to be afflicted with the scarlet rot from birth, but there aren't really references to her spreading this rot and afflicting others prior to the Shattering War. During her confrontation with Radahn, she blooms, and an entire region of the world is effectively destroyed by the spread of her scarlet rot. If we can attribute these increases in power to their great runes, then it seems these shards of the Elden Ring allow each of the demigods to take some aspect of themselves and impose it on the world around them, a rule for many people. But wielding a great rune seems to be beyond the ability of ordinary people. At the beginning of the game, all of the great runes are in the possession of demigods, the direct offspring of God Queen Marika. Or at least that's what we're told by Aeneas, but there's an exception. Rennala, the Carian Queen. She is unrelated to Marika, and nonetheless is introduced as a shard-bearer. Rennala's rune, however, isn't held within her body, but within an amber egg that was given to her by Radagon, and this vessel may itself be a yet unborn demigod, for it bears the great rune of the unborn. What's more, it seems Rennala can't use this rune properly, because although it is said to perfect those reborn, all of the scholars that Rennala uses it on come out wrong. Notably, Renala's rune is also the only one named like this. Every other great rune is named after the demigod that claimed it, such as Morgoth's rune or Godric's rune. So I think this exception with Renala proves the rule, that the ability to act as the vessel of a great rune is directly connected to one's status as a demigod, categorically distinct from an ordinary person. In turn, the ability to bear the combined Elden ring is what would make one a god. But wait, you might say, what about the other obvious exception, the player character, the Tarnished? How is it that we can slay demigods and claim their great runes for ourselves? The short answer is that we can't, at least not on our own. The game draws our attention to the fact that we begin maidenless, and implies that without a finger maiden to assist us on our quest is hopeless. Because of this, we can't even make use of ordinary runes to level up, until we meet Melina. Melina is a character ultimately implied to be a demigod herself, a child of Marika, and our ability to interact with runes depends on her. In order to use a great rune, we must do even more. We must take each great rune to the top of a divine tower and commune with a pair of fingers to restore its blessing. And then we need to sacrifice a rune arc each time we wish to invoke the blessing of that great rune. Even then, the rune doesn't truly become ours. In your inventory, it'll still be clearly labeled Morgoth's rune. And the blessing we get is a pale imitation of the power they were able to invoke from it. In short, we can only indirectly and temporarily tap into the power of a great rune, whereas demigods can attune to them and truly claim them as their own. Perhaps this isn't surprising, though. Ordinary runes are the rule set for a single living being, but a great rune forms a rule that can apply to many people, so it's too great for a single person to bear. Unless they're a demigod. But then, what makes Marika and her offspring so special? Why are they gods and demigods? Let's put the question another way. If an ordinary person cannot hold a great rune within them, what kind of being can? The bizarre answer is a being that is more than one person. One of the biggest reveals of Elden Ring's story is that Marika, the god of this world, and Radagon, the current Elden Lord, are the same person. And this seems to be more than a case of an alternate identity or a split personality, but two distinct people inhabiting the same body. The significance of this is difficult to make sense of, and it's easy to dismiss as just part of the surreal storytelling of From Software. But I think this feature of Marika isn't a quirk, but a fundamental part of what it means for her to be a god of the lands between. She is more than a person. She is a more complete being, because she can hold contradictory aspects within herself. In other words, she's an alchemical Rebis. One of the clear influences for Elden Ring is Hermetic alchemy. While pop culture tends to treat alchemy as a magical practice, the historical tradition of alchemy was a precursor to modern chemistry, and some notable alchemists, like Paracelsus, were early advocates for empiricism, encouraging readers to observe the natural world to better understand it. That said, there was definitely a current of mysticism underlying the thinking of most alchemists, and their conclusions will seem dubious to modern eyes. Still, if we look at the work of real-world alchemists, we'll find some of the inspiration for Elden Ring. First, consider the Rebis. Wikipedia's summary is a sufficient starting point for us. The Rebis is the end product of the alchemical magnum opus, or great work. After one has gone through the stages of putrefaction and purification, separating opposing qualities, those qualities are united once more in what is sometimes described as the divine hermaphrodite, a reconciliation of spirit and matter, a being of both male and female qualities, as indicated by the male and female head within a single body. The Rebis is sometimes treated as a synonym for the Philosopher's Stone, and other sources consider it a necessary step in the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. Either way, it's one of the greatest accomplishments an alchemist can achieve. Sources will also go on to clarify that the Rebis is an allegorical image, a representation of the abstract concept of unifying opposites. I believe that the creators of Elden Ring, however, imagined a world in which this concept was quite literal. The union of opposing elements, such as male and female, growth and rot, body and spirit, or the sun and the moon, is a recurring theme in Elden Ring. In particular, the fact that Radagon and Marika are the male and female halves of the same unified entity connects them to this great work of alchemy. Next, I want to consider sections of the Ripley Scroll, another attempt to describe allegorically how one could create a Philosopher's Stone. Interpreting the allegorical aspects of this scroll is a task for a specialist, but for our purposes, just consider the actual imagery presented. We see the essence of a thing, its blood, spread throughout the world. We see a great tower, at the top of which disparate elements of sun and moon, spirit and body, are being merged. We see people being mutilated and placed into jars, while old men watch expectantly for a divine creature to emerge. Again, these images have a coded meaning of their own, but if you've played the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, you may already start to see the parallels. If Marika is a Rebis, a union of opposites, then the Elden Ring is the Philosopher's Stone in this analogy, a stone which is said to be able to bring about eternal life and miraculous transformations. It's easy to go too far with this comparison, but the point I'm trying to make is that imagery and abstract concepts from Hermetic alchemy have informed the story of Elden Ring, and by imagining Queen Marika as a Rebis, as the endpoint of a long process, we can see that this is not a god that was born, but made. With these concepts in mind, we're almost ready to tell a story. The last thing we need to consider is the Elden Ring itself. We know that it is made up of great runes, forged together into a combined set of principles for all life, or at least all life that is bound to it by grace. As to its form, we know what the Elden Ring looks like, for despite its abstract nature, it has a physical representation, which we find visibly housed within Marika's body at the end of the game. We also know that the Elden Ring existed in the distant past, in the time when the Elden Lord was an ancient dragon named Placidusax. Between that prehistoric age and the time of the Golden Order, where was the Elden Ring? I think that it remained for unimaginable ages within the great golden tree that grew from the energy of the Crucible. The Crucible is said to be a primordial, vital energy from which life emerged, and the Crucible is credited with evolutionary gifts, or mutations, that randomly appear among the living creatures of the lands between. We know that a great tree grew from the Crucible's energy, the predecessor of the Erdtree, and I believe this tree was the vessel of the Elden Ring for eons. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say that a tree was the natural form to emerge when the Elden Ring laid unclaimed for so long. Consider that when we die and drop our runes on the ground, a small spectral tree begins to emerge before we pick those runes back up. Notably, many trees in the real world are also hermaphroditic. They are both male and female. So, like Marika, a tree can naturally represent a union of opposites. In fact, if you look at the shadow tree from a specific angle in the realm of shadow, you can see that it has two bases, and the trunks twist together in a spiral shape. This tree is likely the remnants of the Crucible tree, now veiled in shadow, and its role as the predecessor of the Erdtree is why it's explicitly called the Shadow of the Erdtree. The fact that it is a tree made of two twisting trunks could represent the male and female aspects of this tree combining, making it a complete form of life that can serve as a vessel for the Elden Ring. If you look at the icon on your map with this in mind, it almost starts to look like two lovers embracing. In any case, now we can fast forward to the time of the Hornsent, who worshipped the Crucible as a chaotic source of primal energy, and who prized the horns that randomly sprouted on those who lived in the shadow of that great tree. Such growths were seen as a touch of the divine, blessings from the holy energy hidden away in their great tree. So imagine spending your whole life worshipping a great golden tree and the life-giving energy within it, and thinking, if only I could be so grossly incandescent. And now we begin our story. Because the scholars of the Hornsent culture weren't content to live in the shadow of this divine power. They wanted to become divine. The first attempt of the Hornsent to reach divinity was through asceticism, which we see in the tutelary deities and the ritual of the Horned Warriors. The Horned Warriors, despite their name, were learning martial skills largely in service of improving their ability to perform a ritual dance, and the greatest among them were selected to become lion dancers. The lion dancers are modeled after a traditional Chinese style of dance, in which two people work together to form a single creature, united by their performance. In Elden Ring, this dance can invoke the forces of nature, but the ultimate goal was greater still. Listen to the recitation heard when you enter the lion dancers' arena for the first time.
O horn-decked beast from higher sphere delivered, take root inside the tower's sculpted keepers, and perched within, we beg of thee, rise.
The beast from a higher sphere, referred to in this passage, is almost certainly the beast that literally fell from the heavens in a prior age, the Elden Beast, the last boss of the game, which is synonymous with the Elden Ring itself. Seeking to have this entity enter and possess the lion dancers is a prayer for ascension, for them to serve as the vessel for the Elden Ring, and therefore become gods. The fact that the lion dancers are, by their nature, two people becoming one through a ritual, suggests that the logic of the Rebis was already in play. The Hornsent knew they needed a being who was more than one person in order to house the Elden Ring, and the use of a dance in their ritual might suggest an understanding that the language of creation is motion. And yet, for all of their strength and reverence, no lion dancers ever truly ascended. But, after asceticism failed to result in ascension, the Hornsent scholars discovered something else. A group of shamans who had a unique ability to commune with spirits and connect to other living things. We find the remains of one shaman who seems to have merged herself with a tree in the shaman village, and we can assume that this ability to physically meld with other living things was an important part of their spiritual practices. The Hornsent saw something else, however, a key ingredient for a new crucible. For if the shamans could meld with others, they could be the basis for creating a person who is more than one person, a Rebis. The crucible that the Hornsent worshipped was said to be a place where all life was once blended together. And in fact, the word crucible itself refers to a container where materials are melted together. The Hornsent took this concept and tried to create an artificial crucible in the most literal and horrific way possible, by merging people together inside of great jars. Since shamans have a unique ability to meld with other living things, they were used as the base for each jar while alive, and had countless other bodies, mostly the bodies of criminals, stuffed into the jars with them. In order to encourage the shamans to meld, they were whipped and mutilated beforehand, so that their bodies would try to heal together with the other flesh in the jar. We know all of this explicitly from the DLC, and we know that the jars were supposedly an attempt to raise the interred to sainthood. Many people in the lore community believed that this was just a ritualistic way of redeeming criminals. But I think it was an alchemical experiment, a direct attempt to merge the bodies and the runes of people together to create something new. And eventually, after an untold number of attempts, an untold number of atrocities, they succeeded in the great work and formed the Rebis, their very own vessel for great runes. We know there was a time near the end of Hornsent society when Marika was accepted and considered important, as there are statues of Marika throughout the Land of Shadow, her arms outstretched, as if offering comfort or a blessing to the people of this land. We also have various sources referring to Marika's betrayal, implying that she was in a position of trust, despite being a lowly shaman. If she was the long-awaited saint, the promise of Ascension nearly complete, then she would have been considered a sacred symbol in Hornsent culture. Marika was the promise of a greater, holier future for the Hornsent. So, they prepared to complete the Ascension. I say the Ascension, rather than her Ascension, because we know the Hornsent created the Great Spiral Tower and the Gates of Divinity, but I believe they intended someone else to finish the ritual and gain power over the New Order. Marika was capable of burying great runes, but in order to tap into their power, they needed the same thing we do in-game, a rune arc. The rune arc is a shape that completes and empowers a great rune, for reasons that I'll discuss in a future episode. The point for now is that the Hornsent intended Marika to serve as the vessel for the Elden Ring, but not necessarily as a god, and certainly not as both god and lord. Indeed, the separate role of god and lord may have been part of the Hornsent's plan for the Ascension ritual, allowing Marika to be the source of power, but placing control in the hands of someone else that they could choose. But Marika betrayed the Hornsent, and stepping over a field of fresh corpses, she claimed all of the power of that ritual for herself, gathering the accumulated energy of the tower and the Gates of Divinity and pouring it into herself, becoming both vessel and god of a complete Elden Ring. So began the Golden Order. And so began the purge of the Hornsent, whose faith in the Crucible Marika mocked, by exterminating them using enormous furnace golems. The Hornsent had tormented Marika's people, and Marika chose to perpetuate violence instead of ending it. The Golden Age that followed was supposed to be eternal and perfect, but it was built upon suffering. And that suffering was forged into the very foundation of the world to come. So, what have we learned about Elden Ring? It is a story about the nature of creation and destruction. It is a story about cycles of violence. And it is a story about trying to understand something so distant you can only catch glimpses of it. Despite its fantastical and often surreal setting, it is about universal truths. There is much more to say, but I began with these concepts because I see them as foundational to everything else in our understanding of Elden Ring. Thinking of runes as fragments of a world-making language will give us a rich groundwork for understanding sacred geometries, and geometry is deeply important in a world where the language of creation is shape and motion. Meanwhile, the concept of the Rebis is a lens for us to dive deeper into the most pervasive theme of Elden Ring, duality. Finally, the idea that the fingers are a medium through which the people of the world attempt to communicate with a distant, unknowable will can lead us to better understand the cosmology of Elden Ring and its core artistic vision. Silent ellipsis from the future here. This section originally said that engagement would improve the odds that I finish the theory, but fortunately, we're in the future where I did complete the Grand Unified Theory. So let's proceed directly to Part 2, Sacred Geometry. What does this symbol mean? This is the first image we see when we load up the game, but many players won't even realize when they begin that this is the Elden Ring itself. After all, it's not actually a ring. It's the loading symbol in the corner of the screen. It's the cover art. It's inside Marika's body at the end of the game. But after completing the entire game, I still didn't know how to interpret it. Yet, there is a reason that the Elden Ring has this particular shape. And by the end of this video, you will find it impossible to unsee. So, once again, come with me, and let's discuss the grand unified theory of Elden Ring. It might seem like a fool's errand for me to start with an action-packed game of the year, and end with a video about geometry, of all things. However, Elden Ring has an entire hidden language of shape inside of it, with particular shapes recurring too often to be a coincidence. There's the ring, the spiral, the arc, and others. If we can decipher this language, we will find a treasure trove of connections to make. And yet, no one seems to have cracked the code yet, so let's be the ones to give it an honest try. One thing to keep in mind is that I'm going to draw from many different examples as I discuss shapes. So if it starts to feel like I'm jerry-rigging an interpretation from disparate parts, keep in mind that the creative process for the game likely worked the other way around. I claimed in my last video that in Elden Ring, the language of creation is shape and motion, and I think the creative team behind the game was working with this concept in mind. So they considered first the intrinsic character of shapes, the story that those individual shapes tell, and then they built a world around those concepts. Before we get to the shapes themselves, however, there are two other fundamental concepts we need to understand.
I declare mine intent to search the depths of the Golden Order.
At the height of the Golden Order, Marika launched an inquiry into its nature. It seems that even the god of this world didn't fully understand her own order, and so began Golden Order fundamentalism. Now, the word fundamentalism has a very particular and charged association in our world, but in Elden Ring, the word is meant to express a desire to understand the fundamentals of the Golden Order, and this was an intellectual endeavor, as evidenced by the fact that fundamentalist incantations require intelligence to cast. We know what the end point of this inquiry was because there are two incantations that are labeled as the key fundamentals, namely Law of Regression and Law of Causality. The descriptions of these incantations are extremely confusing, as regression is called the pull of meaning, where causality is said to be the pull between meanings. I think the confusion is intentional, because if you ever tried to read academic theories, they are not famous for being accessible. But let's break down what these spells actually represent. When cast, both spells have you extend and move your arms, almost like the hands of a clock. Whether they are going clockwise or counterclockwise depends on your perspective, but it's still clear that one of the interpretations of these concepts is the forward and backward movement of time. Causality is a chain of cause and effect, the way that one event branches and causes other events as it ripples outward. Regression, on the other hand, is the yearning of things to go back, to reconverge towards the first cause, which is a term in Christian theology to refer to God. This idea that regression turns back time is connected to the spell's effect, which undoes spells and other temporary buffs in the area. However, time is only one axis on which regression and causality act. They are even more fundamental than that. In spatial terms, causality is about the relationship between things, the idea that even as something divides into many parts, each of those pieces is connected to the others, and so they feel the pull between meanings. Meanwhile, regression is the connection that all of the parts share to their source, the shared pull of one greater meaning. I mentioned that the first cause is a Christian term, but causality is an important concept in many religions, and the Japanese term for law of causality uses the word inga, an important Buddhist concept. I don't want to go too far down the religion rabbit hole, because my goal is to talk about these concepts in relation to Elden Ring. But I'll note that the image that keeps popping into my head whenever I think about inga is a Zen stone garden. I couldn't find a source to back me up on the connection within Zen philosophy itself, but when I look at a stone garden, with its ripples weaving between stones, I always think about the way that the stones are related to each other, the fact that each grain of sand or gravel depends upon the placement of everything else in order to find its spot. So, back to Elden Ring lore. We've gotten very abstract, but this relationship between disparate pieces of a greater whole is also very literal in the background of Elden Ring. We learn from Hayeda that all life was once combined into the one great, which divided itself into many pieces to create life. This narrative is also backed up by Ymir in the DLC, who says that all life began with a great rupture in the sky, which sounds like a description of the Big Bang. The descriptions of the Crucible also describe it as a place where all life was once blended together. So we have multiple different perspectives arriving at a similar fundamental truth about the lore of Elden Ring. Everything was once one, until the greater will chose to divide things and create the many disparate creatures of the world. The first cause is the greater will, and the people of the lands between are the many pieces, existing in relation to each other, the pull between meanings, and yet always feeling a yearning for their origin, for a connection to their creator, the pull of one deeper meaning. This is a big idea to unpack in a few minutes, but let it settle and keep it in the back of your head as we continue to talk about geometry, because it will crop up in discussion of our sacred shapes. Okay, time to actually talk about shapes. I'm going to begin with the ring or circle, because it's relatively easy to interpret, and is arguably the most important symbol of the Golden Order. I say that because of the prominence of rings in the fundamentalist incantations. Among the Golden Order fundamentalists were Radagon and Miquella, the Elden Lord and his demigod child, who crafted spells that reflected their understanding of the Golden Order and offered them to each other as gifts. On the one hand, it's utterly adorable to imagine a father and son engaging in a philosophical debate by crafting spells for each other. On the other hand, we know that the end result of this debate was Miquella abandoning the Golden Order entirely, so what he discovered probably wasn't all that lovely. In any case, the circle is in many ways a simple shape. It often is thought to represent completeness or purity, and in Japanese, it is synonymous with something being true. If you were to give someone a true or false quiz in Japanese, they would answer maru for true, which literally means round, and is represented by drawing a circle. However, the significance of the circle shape in Elden Ring isn't quite as wholesome. The primary symbolic role of the circle is an unbroken boundary. The circle clearly divides what is inside of it from what is outside, dividing what is accepted from what is rejected. Consider the spell called Regression, which draws a ring of runes around the caster before pushing away all that is without. The spell Law of Causality works in a similar way. The caster implies a circle with the motion of their hands, and once cast, a small circle appears around the caster that retaliates against anything that tries to attack, anything that tries to enter your sacred space. Miquella crafted several incantations that involve rings of light, which move out from the caster and then return, perhaps an expression of the relationship between causality and regression. Radagon responded with his own ring of light, a spell that represents the father's understanding of the Golden Order as opposed to the understanding of his gentler son. Radagon's Ring of Light makes a single, great ring which emanates from the caster and strikes everything else. This role of the circle as a division between what is inside and what is out connects to the role of circles in the Elden Ring itself, as most of the great runes have a circular shape, which divides those who are within the bounds of its rule of law and those who are outside of it. Indeed, this division between the in-group and out-group, those with grace and those without, is a major theme in Elden Ring's world. We see that those who live outside of grace are oppressed or forgotten, such as the wandering merchants, the misbegotten, or the Nox. We ourselves are called tarnished, because we are part of a group that were once exiled from the lands between, and have only returned now that grace has been extended to us once more, on a whim. Moreover, the Elden Ring shows a series of circles overlapping, which reflects the tendency of the Golden Order to assimilate disparate groups and graft them onto itself, in what you might call alloyed gold. At least, it tends to assimilate groups that are too strong to reject, such as the Carrion Sorcerers or the Ancient Dragons. Those who are both graceless and weak, however, have little recourse but to accept their station as outsiders. Radagon's willingness to embrace this feature of the Golden Order in an unnuanced fashion is expressed in his Ring of Light, for Radagon came to understand the Golden Order and its oppressive character deeply, yet still chose to defend it. Miquella was unable to accept the same truths, and so left to start a new order that could embrace all and bring them into the protection of one great circle, or rather, a circlet. Miquella's circlet says that his new order was to be based upon it, a single, simple, unified ring. This is what Miquella meant by unalloyed gold, not a series of compromises and half-measures, but a single great law that could apply to all. Unfortunately, the single great law he tried to base his order upon was a love that would be compelled by his charm. Miquella's order would indeed have been gentler than the Golden Order, but at the cost of an end to free will. Thus, we refuse to be embraced. One more note about rings. I've been using the words ring and circle interchangeably, but there is a reason why the word ring keeps getting used. If we were going to be a little more precise, the ring shape, or annulus, has thickness to it, while a circle does not. But more importantly, when you bring the shape of a circle into three-dimensional space, you would expect its 3D counterpart to be a sphere. But the ring shape we actually see is flat. It exists within a single plane. This will become significant in a minute. In the meantime, that's one shape down so far. Apparently, I can ramble, so buckle up. Maybe get some water, because we've got more to talk about. For contrast to the ring, let us consider the sacred shapes of a culture that predated the Golden Order. The most sacred shapes of the Hornsent, which were the spiral and the arc. The spiral is a shape hidden in plain sight in the base game, appearing on armor, in spells, and in the sacred relic sword wielded by the last boss. The DLC has doubled down on this imagery, explaining that it was a sacred symbol of the Hornsent, and even telling us in the Spira, or is it Spira, incantation, that it is the shape of a normalized crucible current, whatever that means. Interpreting the shape is hard, because not only is Elden Ring indirect in its storytelling, but the truth of the spiral was clearly hidden away in the realm of shadow. In a recent video, VatiVidya said that the spiral may represent causality, which I thought was interesting because I was thinking of the spiral as representing regression. I see now that it represents both, as I will explain in a moment. But first, let's consider the shape on its own terms. What is a spiral? Well, in 2 dimensions, a spiral is a curve that converges on a point. But that's not actually what most spirals look like in Elden Ring. Elden Ring's spirals are actually three-dimensional helixes. They are a shape that, unlike a ring, only exists in a three-dimensional context. In fact, you could say that the relationship between a ring and a spiral is dimensionality. Take the Law of Regression spell, for example. I previously said that the motion of the caster's hands are like the hands of a clock, but that's only if you consider the motion in 2 dimensions. What a Golden Order way of thinking about it, am I right? If you extend the same motion beyond the plane into 3-dimensional space, the motion of your 2 hands moving around a central axis becomes a double helix, or a spiral. And this is true of any helix. If you look at a 2-dimensional slice of the motion, it's a ring. But add another dimension and the spiral emerges. If we continue our pattern of interpreting Elden Ring's symbols in very literal fashion, then we might say that the Golden Order attempted to flatten reality by trying to create a perfect and eternal shape for the world. Radagon, in particular, was the staunchest and last standing defender of this order, and his own symbol is a grid shape, which we can see as his desperate attempt to hold the existing order together, to prevent change and maintain the status quo. Now, watch what happens when he dies, in the moment that his gridlock on reality is released. We see the rings of the Elden Ring inside his body, flat circles in a plane with the water. Then, as he passes away, the Elden Beast emerges, and draws out from Radagon's body a spiral. This is a direct representation of the relationship between the ring and the spiral, as new possibilities have been unlocked by Radagon's death, and change can once again come to the lands between, depending on which ending you choose. So, if the spiral is necessarily a shape that exists within movement, that gives us another way of understanding the ring shape as an unchanging cycle. If we bring Buddhism back off the shelf for a second, there's a very important concept here that connects not only to Elden Ring, but to all of the Souls games. The wheel of samsara, the endless cycle of death and rebirth. It is one of the primary goals of a Buddhist, and for the protagonist of every Souls game, to liberate themselves from this endless cycle. In the context of Elden Ring, the Golden Order is built upon an eternal cycle of rebirth, as the Rune of Death was removed from the Elden Ring by Queen Marika. Thus, the dead are buried at the roots of the Erd Tree for their bodies and souls to be absorbed and reborn in the next generation. By contrast, the Spira incantation says that a spiral-shaped crucible current will one day reach to the heavens to transcend earthly existence. Notably, most of the spiral shapes in the game are specifically double helixes. The double helix is interesting for several reasons. First, as others have noted, it is the shape of DNA in our world. Thus, the fact that we see this shape connected to the Elden Beast and to the Crucible speaks to the role these forces have in the world of Elden Ring, as facilitators of transformation, of evolution. The evolutionary gifts of the Crucible are direct analogs to the mutations in our world that get passed to future generations by DNA and natural selection. The other interesting thing about a double helix is that it has 2 axes of motion for the bodies involved. There is the motion of the 2 bodies in relation to each other, swirling about each other without ever touching in an eternal dance. This is what we might call the pull between meanings, a representation of causality. Meanwhile, the 2 bodies together are moving along another axis towards a destination, what you might call a shared pull towards a greater meaning. This is regression. And notably, the Spira incantation in particular, the sacred symbol of the Hornsent, moves upward toward the sky, like their great tower, or like the trunks of the Shadow Tree. If all life originated as part of the One Great, in the void between the stars, then this motion is the ultimate expression of regression, of the yearning of all things to return to their origin. So why doesn't a crucible current finish this motion? Why doesn't a tree or a tower reach all the way to the stars? Because in every case, sooner or later, the shape is broken by an arc. The arc is another shape that appears repeatedly in the base game. It is the shape of the item we sacrifice to empower a great rune. It is the shape Marika hangs from within the Erd tree, and in turn, the shape of her own rune, which is found at the very top of the Elden ring. But before we discuss its symbolic role, let's once again consider the shape on its own terms. Mathematically, an arc is a portion of a circle or curve. By its nature, it is incomplete, part of an implied greater whole. What I find more interesting is that an arc has asymmetry, a kind of directionality. It's hard to find the right language for this because arcs don't really have sides, but I'm going to refer to the inner curve and the outer curve of the arc, and to the direction of the outer curve as the direction that the arc is facing overall, because that's the direction that arc-shaped spells tend to move toward. So with that in mind, the interesting thing about arcs is that they present a very different symbology depending on the direction they're facing. The inner curve implies a gathering of energy and is the shape of open arms welcoming you in. The outer curve implies an emanation of energy or a repulsion, much like being on the outside of a circle. In order to interpret the relevance of arcs in Elden Ring, our first observation is that they are frequently depicted facing down. We see this in the rune arc item in the shape of Marika's arms as depicted in her churches, as well as in the starlight gathering basins and the unnamed tower in the realm of shadow. Some of these objects may seem unrelated at first, but consider the innate character of a downward-facing arc. From above, it looks like a basin, a place where energy from above can gather and coalesce. But from below, it has the character of a great weight looming overhead, or the underside of a celestial body. The game encourages us to consider one of these perspectives first, and then the other. The description of the rune arc item brings the basin metaphor directly to our attention, saying that the lower arc of the Elden Ring is said to be a basin in which blessings gather. These rune arcs are valuable objects that confer blessings upon us. But what about the upper arc in the Elden Ring, where Marika's rune sits? This is the shape of the crucifixes throughout the Land Between. And when we finally find Marika, she is herself crucified below a rune arc, revealing the other side of the same shape, that the weight of gathered blessings from above must be carried by whoever is below. Indeed, one analog for the shape of Marika's rune is a chalice. A chalice holds water, wine, or even sacred tears. But in this visual analogy, the stem, the weight-bearing part of the object, is where we find Marika herself. Marika is frequently referred to as a vessel for the Elden Ring. And considering my claim from the previous episode that Marika's godhood may be connected to the jarring ritual of the horn scent, there's a clear connection between the image of a container or basin and the shape of the rune arc visible inside her body. The more oppressive aspect of the arc shape is increasingly brought to our attention the further we get in the game. And in the DLC, we have the arc-shaped spells of the horn scent, which say in their descriptions that the arc resembles the barb, a known symbol of coercive questioning. This is a spell used by inquisitors, so the game wants us to draw a connection between the arc and the enforcement of orthodoxy. The outer curve of the arc emanates force or authority outward in an effort to impose a principle upon those on the receiving end. I said in my last video that great runes contain a rule or a principle for many people, and now we may start to see why we need a rune arc to activate one. You can look at it from either perspective. Blessings gather into the rune arc from above, and when we break it, those blessings pour into ourselves. Or viewed the other way, we point the outer curve of the rune arc down at ourselves, and as the rule emanates, we become the agent for imposing that rule on the world around us. Either way, the same interpretation on a much grander scale becomes true of Marika, holding an arc shape above her head at the moment of her ascension. We could keep going with all the various arc shapes in the game, applying these visual principles to every arc we see, but I want to get to the even juicier part of this video, which is what happens when these shapes interact. So what happens when spirals, arcs, and circles interact? Let's consider the spiral and the arc first. We noted that the spiral has a natural character of movement, and seems connected to evolution and transformation. If the rising spiral in particular refers regressively back to the cosmos as the origin of all life, then the downward arc represents the continued emanation of celestial energy down to the lands between. Moreover, the shape of the arc at the top of a spiral shows the point where regression and causality meet. And let's look at Meteor for the clearest example of what this interaction represents. Meteor's tail, if you can call it that, is a double helix shape, and at the end there are two fingers holding an orb, explicitly called the microcosm. When Meteor casts, these two fingers spread apart and form an arc shape, and the microcosm comes alive, emanating with energy outward in a way that imitates, in miniature, the Big Bang. What I take from this is that the point where causality and regression meet refers to the moment of creation. The spiral unravels into the arc, and this division is synonymous with the act of creation. This connection between division and creation is echoed in the words of Shabriri, avatar of the frenzied flame, who seeks to undo creation. He begs us to destroy all that divides and distinguishes. With this context in mind, let's consider again the relevance of the double helix shape of the crucible as an analog to DNA. The double helix of our DNA contains our genetic memory, but in order to access that memory and create proteins, our DNA also needs to first divide and unravel. This unraveling motion is what gives rise to new life. But we're not done yet, because this lens also gives us a way to dissect much of the plant imagery in the game. Notably, the spiral shape is frequently connected to the crucible tree, which itself has two trunks that twist together. But at the top of a tree, it branches out to form leaves, flowers, and seeds. This painting in the round table hold directly juxtaposes Marika and the arc shape with the boughs of the Erd tree. And we also see a direct connection between the arc shape and seeds in the seed talismans of the DLC, where a seed can be seen nestled in the arc formed by a pair of fingers. So with seeds and flowers, spirals and arcs in mind, let's watch one of the most famous cutscenes from the game, Melania's second phase. Melania has been holding back the scarlet rot within her for her entire life, and this is the moment she finally embraces it. A great flower twists together in a spiral shape. This is the shape of transformative energy, and here it forms a chrysalis for her to change within. When the flower blooms, it unravels in an act of creation and deification. The arcs implied by this blossomed flower are the emanation of her divine aspect, the spread of her scarlet rot. To reinforce the connection of her spiral-shaped flower with metamorphosis, she emerges with wings and surrounded by butterflies. This cinematic has it all. Also note that this connection between the spiral and the unopened bud appears in the Church of the Bud in the Realm of Shadow, and may help to connect this church to the faith of the Hornsent. the church is specifically dedicated to buds, to flowers that have yet to blossom. And we get hints that the people of this church may have had a different relationship to rot than we see in Melania and Caelid. Perhaps the ritual of this church respected the spiral form and the transformative aspect of the bud, but sought to keep the divine energy of rot under control, to prevent it from blossoming and spreading wildly. I'll discuss this more in a later episode, but the fact that Melania's bud is spiral-shaped at least helps to draw a connection for a church that otherwise seems misplaced. I mentioned that the seed talismans depict fingers in an arc shape, and that the end of Metzer's tail, we find 2 fingers that open in an arc, and this gives us a hint about the nature of the 2 fingers. Why are they specifically 2 fingers? Well, it's because what they represent within this world is creation through division, through separation. They are agents of causality. We see in the Round Table Hold that when they are supposedly consulting the greater will, when their attention leaves and they are least active, the least present, their position is closed. Meanwhile, atop the divine towers, pairs of fingers appear dead or catatonic, and yet their position is partially open, and they are still able to function and impart a blessing simply by virtue of their shape. By contrast, the 3 fingers don't form any clear visual shape, because they communicate instead through touch. The 3rd finger is an opposable thumb, which allows them to grasp at the world. The 3 fingers are the most extreme, the most radical agents of regression in the game. So communing by actually reaching out and grabbing us is a fitting metaphor for removing the space between individuals, of undoing what divides and distinguishes. So I'd love to keep rambling about these shape interactions, but I do want to deliver on my promise from the beginning of this video to apply all of this to the Elden Ring. We've already discussed several of its aspects as we've gone along. Noticeably, the modern Elden Ring lacks any form of spiral shape, even though the spiral appears in the more ancient Elden Ring during the Age of Dragons. This tells us that transformative power is suppressed within the Golden Order, which makes sense because the Golden Order is an attempt to create a perfect and eternal, unchanging state for the world. We see that the upper and lower arc point in the same direction, down, and this is the direction in which Marika's divine energy pushes toward the earth, keeping all living things grounded, literally trapped in the lands between. By contrast, consider that the Rune of Death is one of the rare examples of an upward-facing arc, drawing energy from the earthly realm and sending it up, one way of moving on from the world. We can also see that the overlapping circles in the center of the Elden Ring form what I earlier called alloyed gold, a mix of disparate ideas and people linked together and brought within grace. It also represents the set of laws that the Golden Order enforces on the world, which are in between the arc at the top, which represents Marika, the Godhead, and the arc at the bottom, which represents the emanation of her divine will outward to the lands between. In fact, if you look closely, there are more arcs within the Elden Ring's form, gradually growing as they emanate downward. But there is something else interesting that the game implies to us about the shape of the Elden Ring. Consider the Golden Order Greatsword. This sword belonged to Radagon, who took a gift from his wife and altered it to mirror the shape of the Elden Ring, or at least how Radagon sees the Elden Ring. You can see Marika's rune at the top, the handle and pommel of the sword. Then it connects directly to a ring, which is a principle to be enforced by the Order, and it ends in a blade. This item implies to us that, to Radagon's perspective, the shape of the Elden Ring is the shape of a sword. The DLC shows us an even clearer connection between the Elden Ring and a weapon. In order to find it, we have to go down, and then even further down, to the lowest area on the map, the Abyssal Woods. Here we find Midra's manse, and within Midra himself, who is impaled upon a weapon of suppression and torment, placed there by the horn-sent inquisitors to punish him for investigating the Flame of Frenzy. The game shows us this shot of Midra, with the golden barbs of a blade spreading out inside his body. We were told that golden arcs resemble barbs, and now we see just what was meant by that. The arcs spreading out within Midra's body amount to an extreme form of torture. But then there's this curious line in the description of this weapon's weapon art. It says that there's something of the Golden Order in the sight of those fixed upon this crux. I couldn't quite make out what this meant until the next time I saw Marika kneeling in a similar position at the end of the game, with the golden arcs of the Elden Ring visibly spreading out within her body. I think the game wants us to compare Midra to Marika, to see the golden arcs of the Elden Ring within her as a representation of torment. Perhaps this shouldn't surprise us, as we already know that her own rune at the top of the Elden Ring is a depiction of her crucifixion. With this context, there is at least one thing we can say for certain. Marika's godhood is directly tied to her trauma, just as Midra's rise as the Lord of Frenzied Flame is brought about directly by his own suffering. This is what is meant by saying that suffering is built into the very foundation of the Golden Order. It is woven into the shape of the Elden Ring itself. Before all this, I might have said that the Elden Ring looks like a cascading waterfall of blessings, with the gold in each basin overflowing and pouring down to the next. But now that we have discussed it, I can only see the Elden Ring as an expression of Marika's own suffering, magnified and imposed upon the world around her, the world below her. It is Marika's inability to transcend and escape her own human frailty that traps the rest of the world. And the only people more pitiable than Marika herself are those outside of grace, underneath the hovering blade of the Golden Order. Pop quiz. How many times does the word twin appear in Elden Ring? We have the twin prodigies, Mikkel and Melania, the twin omens, Morgott and Mohg. Rellana is a twin who wields both twin swords and a spell called the Twin Moons. There's twinned armor, twin blades, the twin birds, and the twin maiden husks. To answer the question, there are 10 full pages of results if you type twin into one of the game's wikis, and 400 results if you type it into the other. Why? Why is Elden Ring obsessed with twins and dualities? The answer will give us both insight into the dualities we've named, and allow us to find dualities that are hidden in shadows. We will find that duality connects to everything in Elden Ring, and allows us to tie together the most critical parts of the game's lore. So once again, come with me, and let's discuss. So without further ado, it's time to duel. Here's a question that occurred to me when I first played Elden Ring. If Marika is a full-fledged god with the power of the Elden Ring at her disposal, then how did the Carian sorcerers manage to fight her armies to a draw? There's a sense of balance between these two factions, even though the Golden Order is said to dominate the lands between. In order to make sense of this, let's back up and consider a series of related dualities that exist in multiple cultural traditions from around the world, including both Western Hermetic alchemy and Eastern philosophy. On the one side of this set of dualities, we see associations between the moon, feminine energy, the spirit, water, and silver. On the other side, we see the opposing energies of the sun, the masculine, the body, fire, and gold. This set of dualities also aligns with the Chinese concept of yin and yang, or in Japanese, inyo, the characters for which literally mean shade and light. Some of these associations are fairly intuitive, such as a connection between the moon and water, since the motion of the moon leads to the rise and fall of the tides. Still, it's fascinating how universal many of these associations are, and Elden Ring has a habit of drawing ideas from multiple different traditions and synthesizing them into its own mythology. When we look at these associations side by side, we can begin to understand that these related dualities are really a single duality, a division of reality into two types of energy, which manifest in different ways, and which recombine to create the world. This is the underlying meaning of the yin-yang symbol, most often associated with Taoism. Seemingly opposing forces within the world are in fact interdependent, and neither can exist without the other. No light without shadow, as they say. In Elden Ring, we can see these associations everywhere, but especially in Liurnia of the Lakes. Liurnia is a land completely flooded by water, ruled by a matriarchal faction, the Carian Sorcerers, and full of people who revere the moon and are practiced in the art of summoning spirits. This is also the first area where we find Albinorics, artificial life forms with silver blood. This land of silver reflection, serving as an equal opposite to the Erd Tree's golden light, thematically matches with the metaphysical balance between yin and yang. However, there is something about this duality that doesn't seem to add up, because Marika, God Queen of the Golden Order, is female. How does she represent the yang, the masculine energy of the world? What's more, the game heavily hints to us that she is somehow related to the denizens of the night-worshipping eternal cities, and she may even be the spirit tuner that Hugh is indebted to. Those are all connections to the yin side of the duality, aren't they? This discrepancy leads us back to one of the major revelations from a prior video, that Marika and her husband Radagon are a single person. That is, Marika is both male and female. She is an alchemical Rebis, and her status as a unity of opposites is directly connected to her status as a god over the lands between. Indeed, as a being of merged male and female qualities, Marika should be able to represent the balance of this duality all on her own. And yet the Golden Order raises up some citizens and concepts for veneration, while denigrating others. The world is fixed in an unbalanced state, because Marika has aspects of herself that she has suppressed and hidden. Through the Erd Tree, she is shining light on what she wants us to see, but to find the whole truth, we must also look into the shadow. The shadow is a recurring image in Elden Ring, but also a foundational concept in psychology, used by both Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung to describe the unconscious aspects of the mind. For Freud, the shadow was largely synonymous with the id, the base animal instincts and desires that we all experience. In order to function in society, however, we need what Freud called the ego, the ability to separate the id from more productive and acceptable thoughts. Finally, Freud conceived of the superego as a set of guiding principles that direct the ego in choosing which thoughts to bring to the surface and which to suppress. In Elden Ring, we see this connection between shadows and the id represented by characters like Blythe and Malekith. They are both called Shadows of the Empyrean, vassals given to Ranni and Marika, who appear as beast-human hybrids. We first encounter Blythe deep in the woods, howling at the moon like a feral creature, but are taught how to interact with him by Kale, by snapping our fingers. This sound summons him down to us, where he speaks with surprising civility and restraint. despite his bestial nature, he is ultimately a subservient aspect of Rani, a being that is accustomed to being ordered about, and made to suppress his nature. Marika has a similar relationship with her shadow, Malekith. She ordered Malekith to take the Rune of Death and hide it away in the crumbling city beyond time, Far Missoula. When we encounter Malekith, however, he's in the guise of a cleric, his form covered from head to toe, bound by a duty to recover the lost shards of the Rune of Death that were stolen from him. As we progress his storyline and feed him death, we see his bestial nature emerge, and he attacks us without provocation, needing to be physically suppressed by the player before we can once again speak civilly. We eventually have a similar interaction with Blythe, for despite his loyal and valiant qualities, it was the two fingers that played the role of ego to Blythe's id that separated him out and suppressed his violent instincts. Perhaps this is why he responded to our finger snap when we first met him. He was created to be a servant to the fingers. At the end of Rani's questline, however, she slays her pair of fingers that sought to control her fate, and in their absence, there is no ego to control Blythe. Thus, the next time we see him, he has become feral, and his bestial fury is unleashed at us. FromSoft really has a habit of forcing us to put down good boys. So in short, the base game is very Freudian. But the other founder of modern psychology, Carl Jung, had a different perspective on the shadow. The shadow, according to Jung, is the aspect of ourselves that is difficult for us to look at. The aspects of self that contradict how we want to see ourselves. In other words, as we develop a sense of identity, we tend to elevate the inner thoughts and feelings that reinforce this sense of self, while repressing the thoughts and feelings that conflict with it. According to Jung, repression of the shadow is unhealthy, a stopgap in order to get along in society, whereas we should instead aspire to achieve shadow integration, a state of full self-acceptance. It is this Jungian conception of the shadow that we see on display in The Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, for the realm of shadow contains all of the truths that Marika wishes to keep hidden, all of the dark truths that she refuses to acknowledge. When we first arrive in this land, we see in the sky great veils draped over the realm, a very literal image to represent this land being covered up. What's more, these veils may look familiar, for they match the draping cloth over Marika's own bed in the golden capital of Leyndell. With this in mind, the DLC can be understood as an exploration of the skeletons in Marika's closet, or if you want to be even more literal, Marika's dirty laundry. We see this relationship to the shadow reinforced in Mesmer, Marika's child, who she hid within the realm of shadow. Mesmer was born with an abyssal serpent inside of him, and Marika suppressed this aspect of her son by replacing his eye with a false one, an eye that sees through the grace of gold. When Mesmer removes this golden seal, the repressed shadow erupts from within him. So we have a sense of what the shadow represents thematically within Elden Ring, but what are light and shadow in a more literal sense? In our world, light reveals things obscured by shadow. It makes them perceivable and knowable. In Elden Ring, I think we can go a step further and say that light renders things more real than they were before. I claimed in a prior video that the language of creation was visual in the world of Elden Ring, that it was shape and motion. The written version of this language is called a language of light, and we see in various contexts that light forms runes and can bind things and make them real. We see this, for instance, in several catacombs that are filled with enemies made of shadow. These enemies are dangerous, but cannot be harmed until you expose them to a golden light. In our world, light can dispel the creatures of our imagination that lurk in unseen corners by showing us the true shape of the world around us. And in Elden Ring, light forces these ambiguous, half-real aspects of the world to assume a fixed form, If light can be a kind of language, then perhaps it can also serve to name things, to draw a boundary line of identity around what something is and what it isn't. And this is how an amorphous thing comes to be fixed, by having light cast upon it. All light, however, comes from a source, and the nature of that source affects the character of the light itself. So let's consider the most important source of light in our world, and the diminished role it plays in the lands between. The sun is one of the most common objects of reverence in our world. Across cultures and time, the sun is a giver of life and warmth. In Elden Ring, however, the sun's role has been usurped by the Erd Tree, which is the brightest thing in the sky, both night and day. In fact, the presence of the sun is subtle enough that you can find Reddit threads where players ask whether or not the sun even exists within the game. Nonetheless, we know that in the past, the sun was an object of worship, as noted by items like the Sunrealm Shield. We can assume that before the Erd Tree took on this role, the sun was indeed a giver of life and golden light, and the Erd Tree's role is derivative of this traditional role of the sun. So what about the moon? You might think that if the sun represents life, then the moon represents death, but that's not quite right. If we think about the innate qualities of the moon, especially as represented in Elden Ring, one theme comes up most clearly: reflection. After all, the moon doesn't generate its own light. It reflects the light of the sun. Moreover, in places where the moon is venerated, such as the moon-gazing grounds in the Carrion Manor, we see pools of water. The moon was viewed by the people who most respected it through its reflection in the water. And this theme of reflection is a wordplay, for the primary metaphysical significance of the moon is as a symbol of memory. Consider that all of the memory stones found in the game are said to be fragments of a moon that once hung above an eternal city, and the Moon of Noxtella talisman similarly increases your memory slots. So, where the light of the sun gives rise to the present and the physical, the reflected light of the moon connects to the past and the world of the mind. This is where spirits come into play, for Elden Ring makes it abundantly clear that after death, memories remain. We can use a spirit calling bell to summon spirits to aid us as they recall battles past. And the phenomenon of those who live in death demonstrates that death of the body and death of the spirit are separate things. In the age of the Erd Tree, the dead are intended to be buried at the tree's roots so that they can be reabsorbed, body and soul, into the Erd Tree and reborn. But this is only true of the current era, and is a reality that is already starting to break down when we enter the lands between. Indeed, both Ranni's story and Miquella's story involve them sacrificing their flesh and the fate that was tied to it in order to pursue an alternative, spiritual destiny. We noted that water is associated with the moon, and we can also see that it is closely tied to spirits. As you wander the lands between, just look, and you'll see that disproportionately, spirits manifest around bodies of water. Why are the ancestral followers in the lower part of the Shifer River spirits, while the ones higher up near Nokron are physical? Because the ones below are next to the river. The earliest encounters with those who live in death in Limgrave occur in a river and in a flooded ruin. The field bosses that reanimate those who live in death are boatmen called Tibia Mariners. The default, non-hostile spirit we encounter throughout the game is in the shape of a jellyfish. Even our spirit steed, Torrent, has a water-themed name. I want to acknowledge Nameless Singer here, who gives a really solid set of associations between water and death in a recent video. But I'm going to go a step further. I think that water in Elden Ring is a medium for the spirit, and therefore the mind. Water is connected to death because it is connected to the immortal spirit. And flowing water, in particular, can lead spirits to pass on, while stagnant water can leave the dead trapped. This association between water, the past, and the world of the mind has appeared in past FromSoft games as well. For instance, the opening cinematic for Dark Souls 2 features the protagonist approaching ruins by the water, and then within the water, we see a reflection of those ruins as they appeared in the distant past. In Bloodborne, water is used several times to indicate entering a space within the mind. The role of water in Elden Ring has shifted slightly, but the game is definitely playing off of similar imagery and associations. Reflection and depth are visual as well as linguistic metaphors for the internal world. Notably, living things all have water inside them, including us, and including trees. We can, in fact, see that the Erd tree's roots reach all the way down into the deep-root depths, drinking from an underground river that, much like the river Styx in Greek mythology, seems that it once was used to ferry the departed on from this world. If that's all true, it may be that the Erd tree harbors memories precisely because it has co-opted the role of the afterlife, just as it has co-opted the role of the sun. All lives and afterlives now must flow through the Erd tree, trapped in a cycle of rebirth within the lands of between. In order to understand what the alternative is, we need to better understand the concept of death. There's something paradoxical about death in Elden Ring. In our world, we understand death to be the end of life, but in the lands between, there are also those who live in death. There are spirits who seem to persist long after their bodies have perished. What's more, we are told that the rune of death, or destined death, was removed from the Elden Ring, and yet things still die all the time. So what does the rune of death do exactly? In order to make any sense of this, we have to recognize that there are two fundamentally different things that Elden Ring means by death. There is the end of bodily life, and there is that which comes after, the eternal life of the spirit. We know that in the age of the Erd tree, these two meanings are merged, because when a person dies, their body and soul are intended to be returned to the Erd tree. In the age before that, however, death was very different. We get hints about older practices of death from several sources. There are the rivers running under the earth, the Shifra and Ainsel, which carry coffins along a journey to a destination that has since been cut off. There are the Deathrite birds, which supposedly used to burn the dead in ghost flame. And we find in the Shadowkeep burning funeral barges, evocative of a Viking ritual. These images associate death with a combination of fire and water, and all point in a similar direction. Death prior to the Erd tree was about liberating the soul from the body and allowing it to pass on. But pass on to where? We are given the answer in the opening scene of the game. For we return from death to the lands between by crossing the sea from the west and arriving at the Chapel of Anticipation along the western coast. For those bound by grace, death goes nowhere. They are reborn into the lands between. But once the rune of death has been unleashed, souls will once again be able to depart in the direction of the setting sun. With this in mind, we have a new way of understanding destined death. Notably, in English, the word destiny shares a root with destination. Thus, destined death is not just a death that is the fate of all living things, but a death that leads you somewhere else. In turn, perhaps this helps to explain why the game is set in a place called the Lands Between. Between what? Well, consider that we know of two great runes that were removed from the Elden Ring before the Shattering. The Rune of Death, which was hidden in Far Missoula, and the Rune of the Unborn, which was inside the amber egg Radagon gave to Renala. In between birth and death. That is the extent of time one was intended to live in the Lands Between, prior to the rise of the Golden Order, and the sealing of destined death. In order to create an eternal order within the lands between, these two concepts had to be removed from the Elden Ring. There could be no souls leaving, and no new souls arriving. Now we may also be able to understand the opposite of destined death, the Eclipse. The Eclipse was really hard for me to make sense of, because the sun clearly represents life, and so the sun being an eclipse would mean, well, less life, right? So why does the game tell us that the eclipse, the sun drained of color, is the protective star of soulless demigods, keeping destined death at bay? Notably, the word eclipse in this context may not mean the sun is being specifically occluded by the moon. The relevant part is that it has been somehow drained of color, though that doesn't immediately help us answer the question. I have to give credit here to another creator, The Alchemist, for reminding me of something that can bridge the gap: the myth of the phoenix. You've probably heard of the phoenix. It's a legendary bird that is said to pass away in flames, but then to rise again from the ashes. The thing is, the phoenix originated as part of sun worship, for the sun also dies each day and is reborn the next in a fiery red sky. The point is that the sun can represent both life and death as it moves across the sky and sets, and the red hue of the dusk, leading souls to the west, is the color of destined death. This is the color of the death flame wielded by Malekith and by the Black Knife Assassins, who each infused a fragment of the Rune of Death into their blades. Meanwhile, the Godskin Apostles wield a god-killing flame that has no color, and the game tells us that this flame has lost its true power now that death is sealed away. In other words, the flame of the Godskin Apostles is supposed to be the color of dusk, the color of destined death, but it has been drained of color, like the sun in Eclipse. There is another flame that has been similarly drained of color in the current order: Ghost Flame. We see Ghost Flame in the game as a pale white-blue color, but the Grave Violet item says that this flower is the hue of Ghost Flame. If the color of the setting sun is the color of destined death, then it would follow that Ghost Flame, which is meant to be used in funerary ritual after death, would be associated with the color of twilight. Twilight isn't a single specific color, but it often appears somewhere in the muted blue-purple range. And given the Grave Violet description, it seems that Ghost Flame used to have a more purple hue. A poetic word for twilight is the gloaming, and thus it's reasonable to assume that the mysterious figure called the Gloam-Eyed Queen once had an eye reminiscent of the hue of twilight. We can also assume that the Deathrite birds were themselves once much more colorful. In any case, if the sun rising and setting is connected metaphysically to birth and death, then we can see the importance of its role being usurped by the Erd Tree. The Erd Tree shines night and day, guiding all souls bound by grace to stay in the lands between eternally. In this context, let's consider the moon once more, alongside a Buddhist concept from the last episode, the Wheel of Samsara. I mentioned that the Wheel of Samsara represents the eternal cycle of rebirth that a Buddhist seeks to free themselves from. What I didn't mention, because I am sneaky, is that traditional depictions of this wheel also include the Buddha pointing toward the moon to represent an alternative to earthly reincarnation. This is likely one of the inspirations for Ranni's ending to the game. She seeks to break the cycle and find an alternative to the perpetual suffering of the Golden Order by going on a journey led by the Dark Moon. The phrase Dark Moon is synonymous with the New Moon, which represents the end of one cycle and the start of something else. Dark Moon sounds way cooler, though. So following this trail of dualities has led us to better understand the meaning of destined death and the sun and moon. But what exactly is in the west? Where do you end up if you actually cross the sea? When I started the DLC, I couldn't decide exactly what the Realm of Shadow was. Was it a pocket of reality where Marika hid her secrets? Maybe a distant land connected to the origins of life? Could it be the realm of the dead? Now that I've finished the DLC and had time to consider, I think the answer is all of the above. In order to get there, I have to bring up J.R.R. Tolkien. Claiming that a fantasy story is inspired by Tolkien isn't exactly a revelation, but some of the connections between Elden Ring and the Silmarillion are just too extensive for us to ignore. So, a quick overview of relevant Tolkien lore. In an ancient age, long before the events of Lord of the Rings, angelic beings called the Valar established their home in a land far to the west of Middle-earth, the Undying Lands. They created 2 magical radiant trees, one gold and one silver, which illuminated the entire land and produced magical dew made of light. The trees were eventually drained of their light and destroyed by Morgoth, the Betrayer, and the shadowy spirit Ungoliant. But the remnants of these trees were fashioned into the sun and moon, and seeds from Telperion, the silver tree, were taken to Numenor, and later brought by the Númenóreans to Middle-earth, where one of these seeds grew into the white tree of Gondor. So, does any of that sound familiar? Recall that Marika is said to be from a race of unusually long-lived people that come from outside the lands between, called the Numen. When the game came out, much less when I was a kid, you had to be a pretty intense Tolkien nerd to know what a Númenórean was. But now that Rings of Power has been released, I suspect that more people will be able to understand how Numen could be an homage to Tolkien. With this in mind, consider the seed talismans found at Finger Ruins. The seed talismans say that they harken back to the birth of the Erd Tree, implying that Marika received seeds, whether literal or metaphorical, in what is now the Land of Shadow, and brought those seeds across the sea to the land between, to plant in the center of a city that was to be her capital, to grow a radiant tree that was the symbol of her divine authority. The parallel is just too spot on, except of course for the fact that Marika is playing the role of Númenórean and the role of Morgoth in this analogy, but we can't all be perfect. So I was tempted to leave that joke intact, but actually, the fact that Marika is serving 2 contradictory roles in this analogy fits with her role as a union of opposites in Elden Ring. Duality is the theme of this episode, after all. In any case, what does this suggest about the Realm of Shadow? Well, the Valar are nowhere to be found, but I do believe that this is a land that has long existed to the west of the lands between, and was somehow connected to the afterlife. How can we know that? Well, aside from all of the grave and spirit imagery covering every inch of the DLC, there is a smoking gun, namely, the suppressing pillar. No NPCs or other items direct you toward this tower, but if you reach the top of it, there is a plaque, which reads, "The very center of the lands between. All manners of death wash up here, only to be suppressed." This is about as overt as Elden Ring could possibly be about the identity of the Realm of Shadow, but there are a couple of things to dissect about these words. Firstly, this plaque isn't in the lands between, so what does that first half mean? Presumably, it means that this spot is metaphysically connected, or perhaps was once even physically connected, to the center of the lands between. Okay, so then what's in the very center of the lands between? That's debatable, but I think there are really just 2 candidates. The center of the lands between is either the middle of this giant lake, where there is a suspicious cloud on the map covering something up, or it's the Erd Tree. We know that underneath the Erd Tree there are the deep-root depths, which are connected to rivers that transport coffins. So whether it's pointing there or to the center of the lake, the answer is that it's pointing to water. This leads to the second half of the plaque. All manners of death wash up here, only to be suppressed. The phrase, wash up, is suggesting that passage to this realm is meant to be through the water. Somehow, waters near the center of the lands between were supposed to connect the dead to this land. Now, look at the cerulean coast of the Realm of Shadow. There are massive coffins, the size of seafaring barges, washed up on the shore. We are told that these coffins contain the remains of dead who could not find rest. What I take from this is that after the traditional passageway to the land was cut off, some became desperate to reach the afterlife and decided to cross the sea the hard way. Even upon reaching this place, the dead within these coffins are tainted somehow and still do not know proper rest, which is why they appreciate Saint Trina, whose nectar can grant them sleep, a rest that is akin to a proper death. All manners of death wash up here indeed. Identifying the Realm of Shadow as a realm of death also allows us to tie together multiple concepts in the lore. Removing destined death from the Elden Ring, eclipsing the sun, and casting a veil of shadow over the lands of the DLC were all a single action. The Realm of Shadow is now unreachable because destined death led people here. The sun is distant and pale in the sky because it can no longer redden and invoke its metaphysical purpose absent the Rune of Death. The reason Ghost Flame doesn't work correctly, and spirits are still trapped in ashes after being burned, is because Ghost Flame drew its power from destined death. This connection does a lot of conceptual work for us. So you may be wondering, if the Realm of Shadow is Elden Ring's version of the Undying Lands, an afterlife for spirits, then why are there living things here too? Well, clearly there are, or at least were, ways to travel between these two lands. The giant coffin barges prove that it's possible, if difficult, to physically cross the sea, and dragons can presumably fly between these two places. But there may have been some kind of ritual way to travel to this land as well, for we get here by following Miquella. I won't go into detail about this ritual right now, because I'm at risk of getting very far off topic. But the point is, one way or another, people were able to seek out this land of spirits. We see this in Devonia, a Crucible Knight, who set out on a quest from the lands between to find the origins of the Crucible. Perhaps the Hornsent and the people of Ra similarly traveled to this land full of spiritual energy and chose to stay. After all, the energy of the Crucible was stronger here, and the boundary line between amorphous spirits and solid flesh was thinner. Speaking of which, there's one last item I want to draw your attention to, the larval tear. Not the one from the base game, but the special variant that can only be found in the Realm of Shadow, and only at night, in the midst of a circle of spirit graves. This item says that it's an exceptionally rare creature that burgeons from spirit graves, and that it's neither flesh nor spirit, but something in between. Somehow, the boundary lines between body and spirit, between life and death, are fuzzier in this land. Perhaps this is why the shamans, Marika's own people, lived here and communed with spirits. This could even be connected to the reason why their own flesh was so mutable, so capable of merging with the flesh of others. Transformation is clearly part of the domain of the spiral-shaped crucible, and despite their lack of horns, the shamans seemed to be more deeply connected to this energy than anyone else. And this brings us full circle, for the central role of duality in Elden Ring isn't to emphasize difference, but to show the connection between things that appear to be opposites. Thus, Morgott, born a reviled omen, is actually a descendant of the Golden Lineage, and wields the very anchor rune of the Great Elden Ring. Thus, Radagon, a heroic slayer of giants, also bears their distinctive red hair. Consider Mikola and Melania. We might say that Melania's rot is connected to stagnation and decay, whereas Mikola is connected to abundance and growth. On the other hand, we could note that Melania's scarlet rot seems to grow and spread out of control, while Mikola is trapped in the body of a child, never to grow up. So which one is stagnant, and which one represents growth? The two concepts are inextricably entwined, or even twinned. Just as the iconic depiction of yin and yang shows that light is always paired with darkness, everything contains an aspect of its opposite. The world was created by division, and those divisions are reinforced by labels and identities. But identity is a double-edged sword. For every aspect of yourself that you elevate and shine light upon buries another equally true part of yourself within shadow. What does it mean to see something? This might sound like a very abstract question, but in the context of Elden Ring, asking it will lead us on a path toward the most elusive, eldritch entities in the game, and ultimately to some of the deepest truths about Elden Ring's story.
You can see it then, I take it. The guidance of grace.
Tender Mikola's eye is no mere morsel of flesh.
This light once shone in the eyes of your tarnished brethren.
The distant light is far and frail, but with everyone's eyes together, it appears.
So I ask, are we passively taking in the world around us? Or are we engaged in a dialogue with reality simply by opening our eyes? The core concepts in this video inspired this entire series and will completely reframe how you see the story of Elden Ring. So, come with me one more time and let's discuss. So admittedly, that was a bit dramatized, but I am quite serious about this video being the payoff for many of the concepts I've discussed so far in this series. Let me summarize the core concepts you need to know. First, we discussed the nature of runes, and posited that they are part of a visual, world-making language, spoken fluently by the two fingers. These fingers are literally agents of the greater will, and, meta-narratively, represent the actual creative team behind the game, which crafted the world of Elden Ring through the complex motions of their fingers. Next, we discussed the importance of visual symbology, which has an additional layer of meaning in a world where shape and motion are the language of creation. These shapes correspond, among other things, to the concepts of causality and regression, the process by which things divide and recombine as they experience the pull between meanings. Finally, we discussed how this process of division and recombination is expressed in the recurring theme of duality throughout the game. Things that appear to be opposites are, in fact, intrinsically linked to each other, and the ultimate expression of this is Marika herself, a being both male and female, a Rebis, whose ascension to godhood is directly connected to her role as a union of opposites. So, with all of that in mind, let's begin by tackling the most mysterious entities of Elden Ring's lore, the Outer Gods. At the outset of our journey into the Lands Between, we are introduced to two divine entities, Queen Marika, frequently referred to as the god of this world, and the Greater Will, an unknowable, distant being that is credited for both blessings and punishments upon the land. Together, They form the foundation of the orthodox religion of the Lands Between. However, when we enter the Lands Between, this divine order is already breaking down, and through the cracks in the foundation, we can see something else starting to seep into the world, the influence of other divine forces, commonly referred to as the Outer Gods. Little can be said with certainty about these mysterious entities. They don't exist as physical beings in the world of Elden Ring, but as invisible forces influencing the Lands Between through their chosen representatives. We have the Formless Mother, whose domain is flowing blood, worshipped by Mohg. We have the Fell God, source of the flame of ruin, guarded by the fire giants. There are unnamed outer gods of rot and of death. And there are even more enigmatic entities, such as the Frenzied Flame, which is never explicitly called an outer god, but rules over the domain of madness. These beings are by their very nature unknowable. Aside from promoting their domain, be it death, madness, or rot, we cannot know their intentions, or even if they have further intentions. For this reason, they are commonly perceived through the lens of cosmic horror, as eldritch beings whose minds and natures are so alien that we cannot truly fathom them, much like the Great Ones of Bloodborne. They are not malicious, but uncaring, a trait that lends itself to the quiet dread of cosmic horror. Through this lens, we can eventually come to see the greater will itself as an eldritch being that seeks simply to impose order, with no care as to the shape of that order, or the impact that order will have on the people of the world. This is clearly a perspective we are intended to take on the Outer Gods. But there is a wrinkle that grows more and more noticeable as we explore the Shadow Realm of Elden Ring's DLC, for we find ancient forges that remind us that the flame of the Fell God is associated not only with destruction, but with the art of smithing. We can encounter friendly members of the Forager Brood, connected to the god of rot, and they give us recipes for fermenting items to improve their protective qualities, a kind of beneficial rot. We increasingly find hints that ancient cultures had different, even positive relationships with some of these beings. So why are their modern incarnations so reliably destructive? To answer that, let's consider their title, Outer Gods. The name is translated pretty literally from the Japanese, Sotonaru Kami, but there is cultural significance to the character Soto and its counterpoint, Uchi, which can help to inform our understanding here. Uchi literally means home, and you can see that the kanji is sort of like a person inside of a structure. Anyway, the dichotomy of Uchi and Soto is vitally important in Japanese culture, and you can see it, for example, in the entryways to Japanese homes, which always set aside space at the threshold of the home for a ritualistic entry, where you remove your shoes and typically announce yourself, even when space is at a premium in Japan. Maintaining the cleanliness of the inside space is an important part of distinguishing it from the outside, as is observing ritual when entering and leaving. This creates a sort of sacred space in the home. And the Uchi-Soto distinction extends beyond the literal home to social interactions and hierarchies. Here, the divide is between in-groups and out-groups. Beginning students of Japanese are frequently surprised to learn that there are multiple ways to say the same thing, depending on the level of formality that is appropriate. And this formality is determined by the Uchi-Soto distinction. You will use not only different words, but a totally different grammar when speaking to your boss or teacher than you would use with your friends. And it gets a lot more complicated than that, but the point is that in Japanese, Sotonaru Kami can be read to imply that these are outer gods in the sense that they are outside of the current order of the world. We discussed the role of the circle in my episode on sacred geometry, and here once again, the importance of a ring as a shape that divides between those who are inside the bounds of the Golden Order and those outside of it reoccurs within the context of gods themselves. This also reinforces the significance of the ring shape to Miquella's concept of unalloyed gold, which I also discussed there. So, how do outer gods exert influence on the world if they are outside of the current order? Well, indirectly, it turns out. For in order to enter the world, they must enter a person. And to do that, they must first be seen. Eyes are among the most frequently recurring symbols throughout Elden Ring, as is blindness. There's a clear pattern of important characters having one eye shut, including Ranni, Melina, and Mohg, while other characters appear to be fully blind, including Hyetta and Melania. Even Marika herself is consistently depicted in a way that makes it impossible to see her eyes. To decipher this visual theme, let us think back to the beginning of the game. The main character, along with the other tarnished warriors, begins the game exiled, and to add insult to injury, dead. Then the Light of Grace appears, and reanimates each of the tarnished, calling them to return to the lands between. As was noted by a commenter on another recent video of mine, the first item you receive in the game, Memory of Grace, has the appearance of sunlight reflecting on the water, reinforcing that it is the light itself that calls you across the sea to the lands between. After you arrive, multiple characters will ask you if you still see the Light of Grace, an apparent sign of divine favor. In fact, you can see this connection between Marika's favor and the Light of Grace within a person's eye as you play the game, as noted by Zulia the Witch. This Light of Grace appears visibly within the eyes of characters who are accepted within the bounds of the Golden Order, and can even be found in the eye sockets of skulls scattered about the lands between, but not in the eyes of Tarnished, which explains how many NPCs are able to identify you as such simply by looking at you. We can also look to the Golden Rune items for this connection between grace and vision, as more advanced versions of the item gradually come to look more and more like an eye. Now consider that the Erd Tree is the brightest source of light in the lands between. As I've noted before, it has eclipsed the role of the sun, and possibly even contains the sun's light. The light of the sun is the source of all life in our world, and is the light that guides you back from death in Elden Ring. What this all shows is that a significant part of Marika's means of maintaining orthodoxy is controlling light. That is, controlling what you can see. We see this reinforced in the DLC, for the brilliance of Queen Marika's grace blinds even the very best. The Eye of Grace and the Eye of Occultation explicitly describe Marika's clergy controlling the faithful by controlling their vision. And we see this play out directly in Messmer's story, where Marika replaced her own son's eye with one that sees the light of grace, as a way to seal away a dark thing within him. So with all that in mind, how do we read the theme of blindness in Elden Ring? It's tempting to consider it a symbol of blind faith, especially since the starting faith-based class comes with a blindfold. But after everything we've just said, it starts to seem like the exact opposite. If Marika's grace enters through the eye, then closing your eyes is a way to challenge orthodoxy and see the world in some other way. Now consider again that blindfold you start the game with. This faith-based starting class is called the Prophet, and their equipment makes it clear that they were being punished for prophesying the end of the Golden Order. This is the clothing of exiled prophets who foresaw that their faith would end in flames. By the end of the game, we learn that this prophecy was true. Indeed, there is a trope in both Eastern and Western culture of blindness coinciding with the gift of some other kind of sight. In ancient Greece, we have Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes, who has a central role in stories like Oedipus Rex and Antigone. In Japan, there is the traditional role of the Itako, a role exclusive to blind women, who are said to be able to commune with spirits. As Mirko observes in a detailed article on translation notes for the game, Itako is a possible reading of the characters used to describe America's own people, the people we've been calling simply shamans. These shamans are exclusively women, can attune to spirits, and their eyes are never shown. The other character connected to spirit tuning is Roderica, and while she isn't blind, her cloak explicitly says that she never once saw the guidance of grace. So, when one cannot see the light of grace, they gain the ability to see something else. With this in mind, the plethora of characters who are partially or fully blind makes much more sense, for each of them is able to see an alternate way that the world could be, or a different kind of divinity that is hidden from the world by the light of the Erd Tree. Ranni can see her dark moon. Both Mesmer and Melina were said to bear visions of fire, and Mohg has an eye that has been pierced by an overgrown horn. The last thing it ever saw was blood. This also helps us to understand why we can encounter certain creatures and items only at night. When the orthodox light of the world dims, we start to see things that were suppressed by it. Deathbirds and bell-bearing hunters can enter our world, and when we look up, we can see the night sky, a myriad of lights that are not the sun, a veritable sea of possibilities. Indeed, the ancient astrologers were able to invent sorcery by doing this very thing. By looking up at night and seeing the stars, one astrologer was able to see a glimpse of the primeval current, and according to the founding reign of stars, the glimpse of the primeval current that the astrologer saw became real. This is supposedly the first sorcery ever cast. It doesn't say that the astrologer learned something, but that his vision became real. And with this in mind, we can understand something far deeper about the nature of creation itself. We hear multiple stories about the primordial history of the lands between. And as I've noted before, there is a thematic resonance in the most core aspects of these stories. Hayeda relays to us the words of the Three Fingers, saying that all things came from the One Great, which was divided into many things by the Greater Will. Count Emir tells us that we began as stardust, born of a great rupture far across the skies. And there are numerous descriptions of the Crucible that describe all of life once being blended together. Let us take these storytellers at their word for now, and imagine the creation story that they are jointly telling us. The origin of all life in the lands between is cosmic in nature. There was once a fundamentally unfathomable thing called the One Great, a kind of divine cosmic unity. The relationship between the One Great and the Greater Will is ambiguous, but we can make a surprising amount of sense of this story by taking the names literally. The Greater Will could simply be the strongest intention to emerge from this multifaceted entity, a vision of a different way that existence could be, and upon conceiving of this fractured reality, it became so. I use the word vision intentionally, for while the Greater Will is a fundamentally unfathomable entity, we do get a visual representation of it, in the form of Meteor's microcosm. There's a dark void in the center with a corona of light around it, evocative of a black hole or an eye. Meteor is said to be the first star to fall upon the lands between, and to have once received messages from the Greater Will through this microcosm. The hole in Emir's hat is also said to represent the Greater Will, and a few items describe this being as inhabiting a void. The overlapping imagery of black holes and eyes is intentional, for they are on a deep level similar things, voids into which light falls. This is how the Dark Moon is depicted in Ranni's ending, how the Lord of Frenzied Flame is represented, An eye is something into which light falls, and this gives rise to a vision of the world. While we're discussing vision and cosmic reality, I can't avoid bringing up the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. In the early 20th century, physicists realized that the most accurate way to describe the behavior of the smallest things, such as electrons and photons of light, was by using math that involved indeterminacy. That is, by pretending the particle didn't exist in a single place until it was actually measured and located. The equations were useful, but many scientists, including Einstein and Schrödinger himself, thought of this as a mathematical trick and not a real description of the world. The famous Schrödinger's cat thought experiment, where a cat is said to be both dead and alive at the same time, was originally meant to be absurd, to be evidence against treating this math as a true description of reality. And yet, generations have come and gone, and the Copenhagen interpretation persists. Our best model of the quantum world, underlying reality, suggests that in some sense, things only become fixed in place, only become fully real when they are observed. There is admittedly some poetic license in this way of talking about our own world, but for the purpose of discussing a fantasy world, poetic license should be assumed. So in Elden Ring, light emanates from the cosmic forces of creation and falls upon the lands between, but it is only when the golden light of the greater will's emanated intent is seen that it becomes fixed and fully real. This is why golden runes are located within the eye. The words of creation are a visual language, transmitted through light, and made manifest when they are seen, when they enter a person, become known to them. But there was more than one vision for how the world could be. There's the golden light of the greater will's emanated intent, and then there's the light of every other star, every other aspect of the one great that was fractured. These stars are invisible by day, when the greater source of light, the sun, prevails. At night, however, one can look up into the sky and see not just one vision for the world, but many. And when you look deeply into the night, enough light may reach you to form a vision that becomes real. For when you stare into the abyss also stares into you. Since we're discussing the difference between golden light and starlight, I also feel obligated to comment on one of the most inscrutable dialogues in all of Elden Ring. That being Sorceress Selen's description of glintstone sorcery. She says this:
"Our art draws upon the powers embedded in glintstone. But what is the nature of such power? Glintstone is the amber of the cosmos. Golden amber contains the remnants of ancient life and houses its vitality, while glintstone contains residual life, and thus the vitality of the stars. It should not be forgotten that glintstone sorcery is the study of the stars and the life therein."
I cannot overstate how confusing this dialogue was the first time I heard it. What's the difference between ancient life and residual life? The Japanese text can help us here, as the distinction is more obviously between the remnants of ancient life and the remnants of star life. In the context of a great rupture in the sky, triggered by the greater will, this starts to make more sense, as the greater will sent a specific golden star bearing life towards the lands between, and the other pieces of the one great became fractured and scattered across the sky to become the stars. We've discussed that light, whether from the sun or stars, is intended to be seen, but notably starlight that falls and doesn't land in an eye seems to be able to crystallize in Elden Ring, as we can find starlight shards throughout the game. It seems that given enough time, this process of starlight crystallization eventually leads to glintstone, the catalyst for sorcery. The phrase, the wisdom beyond stone also starts to make sense if we believe that glintstone is made of starlight, and that starlight contains fragments of the fractured One Great. Also of note here, the word for glintstone in Japanese translates literally as pyroxene. Pyroxene is an extremely common mineral on Earth, but it can also be found in meteorites. In 1996, a particular meteorite made primarily of pyroxene was analyzed by scientists who noticed microscopic patterns that looked like bacterial fossils. At the time, this discovery was heavily covered by the media as possibly the first proof of the existence of alien life. And while further analysis largely disproved the original claim, this meteorite had a lasting impact on popular conceptions of what alien life might look like. This might help to explain the connection between pyroxene, glintstone, and residual life from the stars. In any case, this divide between golden light and starlight, between day and night, inner order and outer gods, began with a decision of the greater will to fracture life and give rise to something new. This fractured world is the greater will's vision, a term Enya uses to describe the Elden ring inside of Marika, the vision of the greater will. Through the Erd tree, this light can be cast upon the world and enter the eyes of the many. Outer gods, then, are alternate visions for this world, and in order to see them, you must lose sight of the golden light of grace. This is why interaction with the outer gods is so frequently connected to underground spaces, to night, or to places where the light of the sun doesn't reach. These outer gods must be seen by and take purchase within a person in order to influence this fractured world. But why exactly did the greater will want to fracture the One Great in the first place? Why divide the world into its many dualities? In order to discuss the nature of unity and division, and to get at the core of Elden Ring's artistic message, I'm going to bring up an old anime and an even older religion. Let's cover the religion first, and you can look forward to me bringing up anime in a minute. The religion in question is Gnosticism, an early branch of Christianity that included ideas that were eventually deemed heretical by the evolving orthodoxy of the Church. These ideas included the fact that creation was fundamentally flawed, as the creation of material reality by an entity called the Demiurge separated us from the spiritual world and from God. Gnostics claim that we exist in a kind of dualistic purgatory, and we should endeavor to escape that reality and reconnect with the lost spiritual reality. These ideas are connected to other early proto-Christian ideas that didn't make the cut into the canonical Bible that most are familiar with today, as well as to esoteric Kabbalah. There is going to be a test on these terms, by the way, so I hope you're writing this all down. It's not hard to find the parallel between Gnosticism and the creation narrative of Elden Ring, and specifically with the claim of the three fingers, that the greater will made a mistake, and that the act of separation of mortal life from the divine is the source of all human suffering. The three fingers and frenzied flame seek to reunite the physical and spiritual worlds in brutal fashion. In this context, consider Hayeda's questline, where you need to offer her literal human eyes in order to help her find her way to the truth of the frenzied flame. It is individual perception, leading to individual identity, that reinforces the fractured state of the world, whereas by combining the perspectives of many people together, which Hayeda does by literally eating their eyes, she can see the path towards the great unified origin of all things. So, is the frenzied flame correct? Is individuation the source of all suffering? Would we be better off if we all melted back together? In order to answer that question, it's time to talk about a specific anime from the late 90s that I know for a fact Miyazaki was heavily influenced by. No, not Berserk. Everyone knows about that one already. I'm talking about Neon Genesis Evangelion. Now, as promised, I'm going to endeavor not to spoil Evangelion, other than the implication I've made just by bringing it up in this chapter. I am going to talk about its themes, however, and if you want to be very careful to avoid spoilers for the original animated series, you can skip ahead to whatever timestamp I'm putting on screen right now. Okay, so it's hard to overstate the impact that Evangelion had on 90s anime, and frankly on the nature of anime and video game storytelling since then. The inclusion of esoteric religious symbology and the opaque nature of the narrative were incredibly novel at the time, but have become commonplace in the decades since. I feel like Akira and Evangelion gave a 1-2 punch to the Japanese psyche that compelled future generations to tell convoluted stories. And our friend Hidetaka Miyazaki is no exception. In any case, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that the underlying thesis of Evangelion is this. Because people are separate individuals, we can never truly understand each other. The divide between two human souls is the greatest barrier in existence, and therefore we inevitably hurt each other. Nonetheless, we shouldn't try to change that fact, because it is within that struggle to reach across the divide and connect to others that we create meaning. Or to put it another way,
However ruined this world has become, however mired in torment and despair, life endures. Births continue. There is beauty in that, is there not?
now I want to show a single, out-of-context scene from Evangelion in order to solidify the relationship between perspective, division, and creation. All you need to know is that the main character is experiencing a moment of unprecedented freedom from the constraints of the world. Voices tell the character that in this space, he can do or be anything, and yet he expresses anxiety and disorientation. In order to orient him, a voice offers to give him a restriction by drawing a horizon line. This literally grounds our character. It gives him a ground to stand on. And it makes our character one step more comfortable, but requires him to sacrifice a single degree of his freedom. This is the most pure expression of creation through division that I can imagine, for by drawing a horizon line, the distinct concepts of up and down come into being. This same logic applies to personal identity as well, for it is the space between us as individuals that makes identity meaningful. Also, the sound effect when Shinji walks is legendary. Meta-narratively, it's even more fitting that the act of creation is to draw a line, which in the context of animation refers back to the creators, whose entire medium for communicating to the audience is predicated upon drawing lines that form boundaries around people, places, and objects. As artists, they create by dividing. So with this in mind, consider again the One Great. It's true that we cannot possibly understand the true nature of a being like the Greater Will, or an outer god, but it is equally true that they cannot fathom being us. Before creation, the One Great may have been a unified divinity, but without an other to contrast itself with, it had no real identity, and no means of understanding itself. For all of its perfection, what it lacked was perspective. And so, it contemplated itself, the only way it could, by breaking itself into pieces that can refer to each other, that can experience the pull between meanings, and gain individual perspectives. This interplay of perspectives, of competing visions, is what actually creates reality. This is why outer gods can only influence the world through individuals, for they require the active perspective of a living being to make themselves fully real within the lands between. In fact, the nature of outer gods changes with the way they are perceived. Consider, for instance, the Remembrance of Romina, which says, after the church was burned to the ground, Romina discovered a twisted divine element, which she weaved into the baleful scarlet rot. Now, I'm aware of a translation question here, which I will discuss in the next chapter. But for now, consider that we know rot is more than a force of destruction. It can also be a source of protection, as hinted by the fermented items and the material verdigris. Rot is an aspect of the natural world, but in the shadows of the flames, Romina found a twisted version of that divinity, implying that the destructive form of the scarlet rot we see in the lands between is not the only version of the rot that could manifest in the world. The natural form of rot, however, is suppressed by the Golden Order, which seeks to keep things eternally unchanging. Similarly, the Outer God Heirloom says that a clan lost everything in a great fire and saw, in the shadow of their ancestor, a twisted deity. We have the same elements present: a fire, a thing that is normally sacred, and a twisted version of that divinity, seen in the shadows. Notably, the flame itself is a heterodox source of light, allowing one to see the world in a different way. The divinity this item refers to is the Formless Mother, or the Mother of Truth. We said before that this outer god is associated with flowing blood, but now consider that she was found by a clan looking upon the corpse of an ancestor. Consider that she is explicitly called a mother. And consider the altar to the Formless Mother upon which we find Miquella's cocoon. It is sitting upon a great pelvic bone, and when the great hand falls, blood begins to flow down from the center of this pelvis. The Formless Mother's domain is birth. This also tells us why she is called the Mother of Truth, for it is through birth that individual perspectives are created, and it is through individual perspective that truth is born. Yet, traditional birth is another aspect of nature that is suppressed by the Golden Order. We can find the rune of the unborn, separated from the Elden Ring, and locked inside Renala's amber egg. Thus, blood does not flow as it once did, and it is now only the twisted, destructive version of the Formless Mother that can be seen by those who are oppressed and desperate to find divinity. This theme of finding divinity through experience of the world reoccurs repeatedly throughout Shadow of the Erd Tree. The best example is one that seems strange and unimportant at first: Red Bear. This is a man who fought a massive, terrifying bear and became fascinated by it. This led him to develop his own divine incantation called Roar of Regalia, which says, "Only through desperate battle with the feral wild can one discover a god unique to oneself." The description also says that this spell is jokingly referred to as bear communion, implying that it is a kind of incantation that is mocked. And yet, it works. Red Bear succeeded in discovering a god unique to himself. This tells us that in Elden Ring, divine truth is not a static thing to be preached about, but something to be found through direct experience, much like our experience of the game world itself. Indeed, there is a clear connection between the theme of creation emerging through competing perspectives and the artistic process behind the game. I have already alluded to the fact that the two fingers being conversant in an inscrutable language of creation is a meta-narrative allegory for the creators behind the game, who created the world of Elden Ring through the complex motion of their fingers. And there's an even deeper level to this meta-narrative interpretation that we have available to us now. Because Elden Ring doesn't have a canonical truth explicitly handed down to the players. Rather, the truth of the game is discovered by those of us who play the game, struggling in desperate battle with the feral wild, and searching for divine elements in the shadows. So for the final section of this philosophical tirade, I want to delve a little deeper into the creative process behind the game. There was a commenter on my first video who loved the meta-narrative connection between fingers and the developers, and said, following that logic, the Greater Will could meta-narratively be the developers, and the reason no one can contact the Greater Will anymore is because the game is done development. I thought this comment was very funny, but what if we take it very seriously? With a couple of caveats, we will find a deep artistic truth behind the game, and the true identity of the Greater Will. One unavoidable issue when analyzing a game like Elden Ring is that while I'm speaking to you in English, the game was created by a Japanese team. As much as I may try to bring up Shinto or Buddhist ideas to provide context, there is a barrier between our experience of the game as an English-speaking audience and the experience of a Japanese audience. And this brings us to the topic of mistranslation. I brought up Mirko as a reference, and their translation notes on Shadow of the Erdtree are detailed and insightful. They give us alternate possible translations for several key item descriptions. But there is an assumption underlying this analysis that warrants further scrutiny. Mirko says, the working method used for these translations does not favor the translators, as they often receive lines of text without any context of when and how they would be used. This is true of video game translation in general, but there is a caveat for us to make, specifically with the English language as used in Elden Ring. For English has been part of the creative process for the game since its inception. It's no secret that George R.R. Martin was involved with writing the story for Elden Ring, and from various interviews, we can know exactly what his contribution looked like. Martin says that his job was to create a world-building document, to outline the history and mythos of the Lands Between, prior to the actual events of the game itself. After several exchanges, Martin had a complete document, a text, that he handed over to the Japanese team, which they used as the starting point and inspiration for building an entire virtual world, and writing the plot and dialogue that we experience as players. Martin's role was finished at this point, and for the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, Miyazaki made it clear that the team was able to meaningfully refer to the original document for inspiration, but that Martin did not contribute any new text. What this means is that in a meaningful way, the creative process for Elden Ring began in English. And we know that Miyazaki was very concerned with the translation into English because all of the spoken dialogue in the game was to be recorded in English, even for the Japanese audience. This may seem very odd, that a Japanese game written primarily by a Japanese team would be voice acted in English, and expect its Japanese players to read subtitles in order to understand what was being said. However, this has been true of most of From's projects for over a decade, and Miyazaki has said that part of his inspiration for the entire Souls series was to recreate the experience he had as a child of reading Western fantasy novels, translated into Japanese, and feeling lost in the mystery of foreign words and concepts. In other words, mistranslation isn't an unfortunate side effect of developer limitations. It is an intentional and important part of the experience. The creators want ideas to get lost in translation, back and forth between English and Japanese, to create this organic sense that no one person or language can hold all the pieces of the puzzle. That viewing the same thing through a different lens allows you to see something new, just as one can find a new divinity by looking into the shadow of something sacred. This may be different for the Italian or German translations of the game, but in the case of the English text, there is reason to consider it as integral to understanding the lore as the Japanese text is. Even in Japanese, there is intentional ambiguity worked into the language. Take, for example, my prior note, credited to Mirko, that the word for shaman could be read as itako, a blind spirit medium. Well, here is the most typical way to write itako in Japanese. And here is the typical way to write miko. The actual compound kanji used in Elden Ring is a mix of these, so it's not immediately obvious which way it should be read, though it is clear that the word being conveyed is somewhere in that realm. Elden Ring is a story that is fundamentally about perspective, and the impossibility of perfectly understanding another person's soul. Linguistic and symbolic ambiguity are central to the game's artistic vision. And with that in mind, let us consider one more time the meta-narrative allegory we began this series with. The two fingers speak a kind of visual language that we struggle to understand, but they are said to be conveying the intent of the greater will. At the end of Shadow of the Erdtree, however, we get a massive revelation, that the mother of all two fingers, Metyr, hasn't actually received any messages from the greater will in eons. In the context of the translation issues we just mentioned, it becomes clear that in our meta-narrative allegory, Miyazaki is not the greater will. No, Miyazaki is just weird enough to cast himself in the role of the eldritch creature called Metyr. Think about it. Metyr was the first being to reach the lands between, tasked with the role of creating a world. She receives messages bearing the intended vision of the greater will from an item called the microcosm, and she interprets these messages and then sets about relaying this vision to each of the fingers that she creates, delegating to them the task of inscribing the language of creation into the world. But shortly after they begin, messages from the greater will cease. Metyr is left alone to interpret the intent of the creator imperfectly, and imperfections proliferate from her to the fingers, to Marika, and to the entire world. The greater will is George R.R. Martin. The microcosm is the world-building document Martin wrote, in English, as the initial vision for the lands between, which then had to be interpreted by a development team that didn't natively speak his language, and then turned into an entire world. This artistic vision was fractured, changed, and then relayed to hundreds of developers, who each had to filter the vision through their own understanding. This fractured world was then offered in turn to millions of players, who each had to struggle individually to find meaning within the game, and over the course of years, to recombine their understanding into a shared vision of what Elden Ring is. And we find within the game factions and outer gods that can validate and reinforce our many understandings of the game. If we believe that this game is about deciphering the inscrutable intent of the creators to find a harmonious truth, we can follow the path of the Noble Gold Mask. If we think that the game is really about player versus player combat, then we can join the ranks of the Bloody Fingers. And if we think that a search for meaning is futile, then we can melt it all away in the searing flames of chaos. This allegory is about more than Elden Ring. This story is about the process of artistic creation and the process of understanding. For we live in a world where our practical needs and the weight of identity drive us to find shortcuts for truth. We become accustomed to perceiving ourselves and others in a particular light, and accepting the world we see as the way things are. But in order to learn something new about ourselves, we must gain new perspective. And we do that by breaking bits and pieces of ourselves off and building them back together into something new. Then we observe it, to see what those pieces say to us about the inscrutable whole. And however strange and imperfect those pieces are, when light passes through them and shows us something new, there is beauty in that. Even the grandest of lore theories spark new questions of their own. How can Miquella become a god after shedding his Empyrean flesh? How can a beast be both horn-decked and without horns? And how can we hope to interpret a story that is about the impossibility of true understanding? It's time to start tackling the tough questions. So put on your highest prescription interpretive lenses and get ready for some answers. This is Gut Check. This is a follow-up to the main episodes of the Grand Unified Theory, aka The Gut, and is intended as a way to keep myself accountable by responding to common questions and feedback that has accumulated over the course of a year or so since I released my first episode. This will be a little more freeform, but Gut Check is organized into 3 parts. The first is on missed connections, ideas that were cut from prior scripts for pacing or other reasons. The second part is answering frequent questions, and the third part is answering just one question. What is the Grand Unified Theory? Since I get very abstract and even poetic at times, I wanted to address the punchline in more concrete terms for those who felt they were missing that. So, without further ado, let's begin our missed connections. I've made a big deal about the importance of the greater will communicating through a visual language, and even claim that golden runes are fragments of the language of creation, a language transmitted through light. But with all this light and eye imagery taking center stage, what is the role that sound plays in Elden Ring's world? There is a clear answer to this question, as sound is consistently used as a means to summon spirits. Not only does the player use a bell to summon spirits, but several enemies use sound to summon, such as tibia mariners and spirit-calling snails. We even see this connection with the walking mausoleums. Some mausoleums have bells hanging from them, and in turn are surrounded by the spirits of mausoleum knights that guard them. Meanwhile, walking mausoleums without bells are unguarded. This is a consistent pattern, so there's a direct connection between the bells and the presence of spirits. Similarly, we also see a headless spirit troll appear to guard the 4 belfries. Even though we don't hear bells ringing, a belfry is specifically a structure made to hold a bell. While there are some spirits present without an obvious source of sound to summon them, there's a consistent pattern throughout the game. So, why would sound be connected to spirits? First, consider that the other imagery we see commonly associated with death and spirits is water. In our world, ships frequently use sound to communicate when light is unable to reach them. Sound propagates better than light does through water and through fog. Thus, we have the foghorn and sonar. Sonar uses sound to map the expanse of the deep sea because it can reach where light cannot. So if water is a medium for spirits, which I claimed in my Duality episode, then it makes sense that sound is the best way to reach them. Secondly, sound is connected with human memory. While spoken words may not be in the language of creation, they are how mortals pass on their experience to each other. So for example, Melina, herself a spirit, is able to hear the spoken echoes of Queen Marika and recite them to us. These aren't fundamental truths Melina is hearing, but the subjective experiences of Marika as a person that are being recounted. Finally, Elden Ring is a Japanese game, and using sound to call spirits is part of Shinto tradition. When you approach a Shinto shrine, it is common practice to clap twice and bow, to gather the attention of the spirit of the shrine and then show it respect. This association makes the spirit summoning power of sound an intuitive connection for a Japanese audience. But while sound is the language of mortals, light is still the language of the divine. And with that in mind, let's look a little deeper at some deeply misunderstood objects. Stone astrolabes. I make reference a few times in my videos to the starlight basins in Elden Ring, which the community often refers to as stone astrolabes. But you might not know that this object is modeled after an ancient Greek sundial, or hemicyclium. There are multiple Reddit threads that have mentioned this, so I'll link below to the first one that I happened across. The needle that extends from the center of this arc will cast a shadow that moves over the course of the day, making this object effectively just half of an analog clock. However, in Elden Ring, none of these basins seem correctly aligned with the motion of the sun. Rather, these stone basins are clearly connected to starlight, as they are the primary place we find starlight shards throughout the game. There is a possible connection here back to quantum mechanics. As I discussed in my Vision episode, light and other quanta in our world need to be observed to have their position fixed. However, observation in this context doesn't have to be done by a human eye. Any kind of measurement will fix a particle in place. So a sundial or a star dial, by measuring light, can act like an artificial eye. That means starlight basins may be creating starlight shards simply by measuring starlight, and therefore causing the light to assume a fixed position. This is made extra literal in Elden Ring by having the starlight crystallize and become a solid object. While we're talking about vision, let's also talk about the emission theory of vision and the evil eye. There's an antiquated theory of vision that may sound silly at first glance, but connects to some pretty deep human intuitions. Plato and most of the ancient Greeks believed that vision was possible because of a kind of invisible fire that would reach out from your eyes and touch the world. This fire would interact with the light that was ambiently present and become perception. One possible reason that this theory was popular even into the Middle Ages is that animals such as cats and foxes have highly reflective eyes that appear to glow in the dark. If cats emit light from their eyes in a fairly obvious fashion, perhaps humans do it, just in a more subtle fashion. Either way, this model of vision connects to a belief that vision can influence the world around us, a belief that underlies the myth of the Medusa, for example, and the very widespread superstition of the evil eye. The evil eye is a kind of curse brought about by a malevolent gaze, particularly of those who envy you. To ward against this curse, talismans and amulets, such as the Nazar, have been popular throughout the Middle East, Central Asia, and parts of Europe for thousands of years. So what does all of that have to do with Elden Ring? Well, I dedicated a whole episode of the Grand Unified Theory to vision, and the idea that within the lore of the game, we literally shape the world around us through our vision of it. I focus on quantum mechanics as the launching point for this, but after bringing up the emission theory and the evil eye, it should be clear that there is a deep-seated intuition that we can influence the world merely by looking at it. And it is this intuition that Elden Ring is building upon with its omnipresent eye imagery. In Elden Ring, the influence of divine forces can be seen by looking at a person's eye, and the vision of most is dominated by the golden light of the Erd Tree. But the absence of one particular color from this light links the themes of Elden Ring back to one of the first topics I ever brought up: hermetic alchemy. In retrospect, I don't know why I chose not to bring up Rubedo in my very first episode, but here we are. We're talking about it now. I did mention hermetic alchemy in my first video, and suggested that Marika can be understood as an alchemical rebis, a union of opposites, most obviously symbolized by her sharing her identity with Radagon. In short, Marika, merged with Radagon and bearing the Elden Ring, is essentially a philosopher's stone. In historical writings, there's a standard set of alchemical stages that are supposed to lead to the creation of the philosopher's stone. Different alchemists suggest a different number of stages, but there are 4 near-universal stages that are each associated with a particular color. They are Nigredo, black, Albedo, which is white, Citrinitas, which is yellow, and Rubedo, which is red. In simplified terms, Nigredo is the process of mixing disparate elements together, and Albedo is the process of separating out impurities. These are what I referred to in my first episode as putrefaction and purification. The third stage, Citrinitas, also called Xanthosis or the yellowing, is the step where the mixture begins to transcend normal properties and achieve a solar awakening. This step is, naturally, associated strongly with the image of the sun, but the specific meaning of solar awakening is up to a lot of interpretation. In Elden Ring, a lot of sun imagery is associated with the Erd Tree, so Marika having undergone a solar awakening is a concept that makes sense. But, no matter how this step is interpreted, Citrinitas is not the final stage of the great work. Over the course of years, the Philosopher's Stone becomes perfected through the final stage called Rubedo, or the reddening. For this reason, the Philosopher's Stone is often depicted as red, and even being directly associated with the color of blood. And this is where our Elden Ring connection becomes interesting, because the game goes far out of its way to make it clear that the color red is forbidden and suppressed. Red is the color of transformative and destructive forces that could change the Golden Order, such as the Flame of Ruin, the Scarlet Rot, the bloody fingers of the Formless Mother, or the dusk-colored Rune of Death. We also have multiple items telling us that in a prior age, primordial gold had a red hue. Marika is actively preventing Rubedo and the completion of the current age, presumably in a desperate attempt to make her order eternal and unchanging. So once we identify that the symbology of hermetic alchemy is at play within Elden Ring, we can realize that from the very beginning of the game, the pale yellow gold of grace, the Erd Tree, and the entire Golden Order is a sign that this entire world is trapped in a flawed and incomplete state. It's worth noting yet again that in historical alchemy, many of these colors and images are meant to be allegorical and symbolic. But Elden Ring has a habit of treading in symbology made literal, and the suppression of Rubedo is no different. It's also worth noting that Carl Jung, who was mentioned in my Duality episode, was also fascinated by alchemy and devised a set of psychological archetypes that correspond to the stages of the great work, culminating in Rubedo being the actualization of the individual self. I don't have time to fully delve into the Jungian interpretation here, but it's certainly fair to say that Marika has a complicated relationship with identity, and has not fully accepted aspects of herself. You're also likely to find a lot of Jungian analysis mixed in with historical alchemy if you go looking up these connections yourself, so be prepared for that. Now you might have noticed that I've been referring to yellow and gold almost interchangeably in this section, and that sets us up nicely to discuss horseshoe theory. There's a point I raised, but never explained in my color theory video. If the game didn't tell you in advance that this color was gold and this color was yellow, would you be able to tell which was which? The similarity of gold and yellow might unsettle us, because within Elden Ring's lore they represent deeply opposed divine forces. Gold is associated with the greater will, and is the color of order. Yellow is the color of the frenzied flame, and represents chaos. And yet these two extremes are repeatedly juxtaposed. The 3 fingers that bear the yellow flame of frenzy are not found in the distant reaches of Elden Ring's map, but directly underneath the golden capital of Leyndell. Midra, who rises as Lord of Frenzied Flame, is found impaled by a weapon that says, "There is something of the Golden Order in the sight of those fixed upon this crux." I noted before that the image of Midra parallels the image of Marika, with the golden arcs of the Elden Ring extending inside her. This also doubles as a direct comparison between Marika's Golden Order and the people she despised more than any other, the Hornsent. Either way, the comparison leads us to horseshoe theory. This is a notion usually brought up in political discourse, to suggest that extreme enough ideologies, even when opposed, start to look similar to each other, and have a high risk of collapsing into anarchy or authoritarianism, or one followed shortly by the other. Now, I'm not actually here to talk about politics today, but for the purpose of our discussion, consider that this dynamic also applies to ideas themselves. The distance between great love and great hatred, or between madness and genius, can be a mere hair's breadth. The kind of nuance and complexity found in everyday reality depends on a delicate balance of forces, but grand ideas have a tendency to impose unnatural simplicity on the world. The Golden Order is attempting to create a perfect and unchanging state for the world, and stamp out or suppress anything that challenges that vision. But in its own strange way, the Frenzied Flame of Chaos is attempting to achieve the same thing. A perfect, unchanging state for the world, after all that divides and distinguishes has been melted away. Once the great fire has finished raging, it may no longer make sense to call the result chaos, because it would end with a perfectly ordered, perfectly divine world, where all is one again. And there's another strong parallel the game makes between the Lord of Frenzied Flame and the God Queen of the Golden Order: ascension through suffering. Midra's eternal torment is implied to gradually strengthen his connection to the Three Fingers, and when he has endured enough, he arises as the Lord of Frenzied Flame. But at the same time, the game draws our attention to the great suffering in Marika's past, and the great torment endured by the shamans that underlies her own godhood. We also have Miquella, who repeatedly claims that his own path to godhood is motivated by the great suffering he sees in the world around him. In short, mortal lives depend upon a delicate balance within the world, and great suffering leads one to instead reject the world as it exists and seek refuge in the divine. The many forms of solace offered by divinity end up more similar than they first appear. The oblivion of St. Trina's deep sleep, the serene madness of the Lamenter, or the eradication of boundaries by the flame of frenzy, all lead to an end of complexity, an end of individuality, and an end of suffering. So, gold and yellow are similar in color because they represent aspects of the same divinity, just as the 2 and 3 fingers imply a single complete hand. Speaking of a lost divinity, there's one more topic I didn't get to, and it also connects to color theory, namely, the lost dragon god. So I wanted to have a section here connecting the red lightning of the ancient dragons to Rubedo, and talking more about the era of Placidusax and the fate of the lost dragon god. But the truth is, I have so much to say about it that I've decided to spin this off into a future Between Meanings episode, all about the ancient dragons. In the meantime, I intend to fulfill my promise and respond to some of the frequent questions and comments I've received. Along the way, we will stumble across even more nuggets of lore and connections that I haven't expounded upon yet. So, stay tuned even if this wasn't your question. Now, I've received many questions over the course of the series, but let's start off hot and heavy by answering the single most common question I have received on my videos. Am I Charred Thermos? If you don't know, Charred Thermos is a YouTuber who primarily analyzes Bloodborne in a series called In Agony of Effort. Specifically, he analyzes the story through a chosen lens of Victorian medical history and interprets the entire game through that lens. For instance, insight, or eyes on the inside, can refer to the knowledge that Victorian doctors gained through the process of dissection, by literally looking inside of the human body. In short, the answer is no, I am not Charred Thermos. And just to be sure, I emailed him to double check, and he also agrees that we are not the same person. That said, I do understand why so many viewers asked this question. We have a very similar approach to analyzing a FromSoft game. Like Charred Thermos, I began with a thematic lens, and then built an ambitious interpretation on top of it. We also have similar voices, apparently. In fact, I tested this voice similarity by putting on a Charred Thermos video while my wife was asleep on the couch. When she woke up, she looked at me and said, "Wait, when did you make a Bloodborne video?" So I can't blame any of you for thinking our voices sound similar when my own wife got tripped up. Oh, and surprise, I have a wife.
Reflection on all the cleaners and all the real fragments.
So with that out of the way, I'll respond to other points in semi-chronological order. In my first episode, I noted that the Lion Dancer fight begins with the line, "O horn-decked beast from higher sphere delivered, take root inside the tower's sculpted keepers," and called it a prayer for ascension. It seems noteworthy that we know of a beast that quite literally fell to the earth from the heavens, the Elden beast. And given all the evidence that the Hornsent were attempting to create a god, and may have succeeded, this line could be referring to the Elden beast, and the Lion Dancers in turn as an initial attempt to merge the identities of two people to create a being that could bear the Elden Ring. I think this is a solid connection, but I do understand why some viewers responded that I seemed overconfident in that point, when the Elden beast isn't horn-decked. How could it then be the horn-decked beast from a higher sphere? The missing piece is what I addressed in my Vision and Cosmology episode much later, that divinity in Elden Ring doesn't have a fixed form, but shifts with how it is perceived. So firstly, we don't actually know what the Elden beast looked like in the era of the Hornsent. At that time, it was likely connected directly to the energy of the Crucible, so maybe it literally did have horns in the past. But equally likely is that the Hornsent would project their image of divinity onto a being they didn't fully understand. To them, horns and divinity are practically synonymous, so of course the holy beast that incarnates order would be horn-decked. The greater point here is that divinities in Elden Ring might best be understood as aspects of the divine, more so than as separate beings with consistent traits. The lore is rife with stories of people discovering new divine aspects through adversity or struggle, and these references are even stronger in Shadow of the Erdtree, which directly compares Redbear's god unique to himself to the religion of the Hornsent. So perhaps if you pray with horns in mind, then the holy forces of the Crucible respond with horns. And if you pray with a bear in mind, and believe deeply enough in the divinity of bears, then the holy forces of the Crucible respond with a bear. Either way, in retrospect, I would have worded the point differently, but I still stand by the underlying connection. But what about Miquella's godhood? I also claimed early on that being a demigod is synonymous with having the ability to bear a great rune, and that being a god is synonymous with the ability to bear the Elden Ring. However, many people asked how this comports with Miquella, who gave up his body entirely and yet is identified as a god in the game. Or, for that matter, what about Ranni, who also gives up her body and yet becomes the god of the Age of Stars in her ending? So there's two responses. Firstly, both Miquella and Ranni, as Empyreans, presumably could have borne the Elden Ring in the way that Marika did, but chose not to, because they want to bring about a different kind of order, rather than simply replacing her. But that still leaves the question, what does it mean for Miquella to be a god without a body to be the vessel of anything? As I mentioned at the very end of my first episode, Marika is both god and lord of the Golden Order, as well as vessel for the Elden Ring. But this is particular to the current order, and not all of these roles are typically played by the same person. God and Lord may be separate individuals, and the god of an order might not need to be the vessel of the Elden Ring. Rather, the god is a being capable of communing with the divine, and serving as a sort of bridge between the divine and mortal world. Marika does this in the most direct way possible, by physically bearing the Elden Ring. But in Ranni's ending, she appears to offer Marika up to the Dark Moon. So it's a reasonable interpretation that the moon will become the vessel for the Elden Ring in the New Age of Stars, and that Ranni will serve as the conduit, connecting its divine power to the world. In Miquella's case, I think it is extremely telling that he brings his great rune to the base of the Shadow Tree and sacrifices it there. His whole deal is attempting to undo the sins that underlie Marika's order, and in this case I think he is returning his rune to the Shadow Tree itself. Notably, after doing so, he is nonetheless able to invoke the rune's power, because he is still connected to it somehow. In other words, the Great Rune was placed into a vessel that he has communed with, and he presumably would have proceeded to do the same thing with the other pieces of the Elden Ring if we hadn't confronted him. This indeed may be the future hinted at by the very end of the original trailer for Shadow of the Erd Tree, where Miquella looks up to a Shadow Tree that has had its iconic wound healed. I haven't heard anyone else talk about this shot, but it strikes me as pretty revealing. So yeah, God and vessel can be separate things, and this idea will definitely come back up whenever I get around to discussing the Age of Placidusax. In the meantime, let's answer the question, is R'hllana a twin? Many people noted that I referred to R'hllana as a twin, but that this seems to be contradicted by two items that refer to Rennala as her elder sister. Nonetheless, every aspect of R'hllana's theming and design is built around the concept of a twin, from her choice of weapon, signature spell, title, and even the fact that her name is so confusingly similar to her sister's. In fact, just consider the imagery of the twin moons on its own. The spell says that these moons, met by R'hllana and Rennala together, are overlapping as though nestled against one another. The moon is frequently associated with femininity, and specifically with pregnancy, as we see on full display in Bloodborne. So the image of two overlapping moons, connected to two sisters, is a fairly on-the-nose symbol for a twin pregnancy. So with all of that in mind, I have a question for you. Have you ever met a twin in real life who made a big deal about being the older sibling, even though they were older by maybe a half hour? This will usually sound like a silly technicality, but consider for a moment what that means in the context of hereditary monarchy. Only one child can inherit the title of queen. No matter how small the difference in age or ability, Rennala, by virtue of seniority, inherits all of the political power and prestige that comes with being Queen of Caria. She then also becomes head of the Academy, and wed to an illustrious champion of the Erd Tree. R'hllana, meanwhile, is shown to be Rennala's equal in every respect. They encountered the twin moons together as children. R'hllana's signature sorcery requires an even higher intelligence than Rennala's does. R'hllana also had time to master the use of twin swords, and yet, no matter how accomplished R'hllana is, her entire life has been defined by being the younger sister of Rennala. Think about how much more devastating that fact is if they are twins, born on the same day, mere minutes or hours apart. R'hllana is no queen, no head of the Academy, and no wife. she is overlooked at every turn by a technicality of her birth. That sounds to me like the kind of backstory that would lead her to renounce her birthright and follow Mesmer into the Shadow Realm. She has already lived her whole life in Shadow, and she saw a kindred spirit in Mesmer, a child of Marika, nonetheless made to live his own life in the shadows. Now, again, no item description explicitly confirms all of this, but this is what I had in mind all along, and I still think it makes for a more compelling and complete story if R'hllana is secretly Renala's twin, so I for one am going to continue believing it. On a similar note, is Radagon a giant slayer? In the same video, I made a passing reference to Radagon as a slayer of giants, and in retrospect I should have actually explained a couple of these references rather than just dropping them and moving on. But once again, there is a thought process behind it, even though there is no explicit description of Radagon slaying giants. Firstly, in my view, Radagon has always been part of Marika, at least since her ascension, so if she was physically present for the War of the Giants, which we know is true, then Radagon was as well. Moreover, there's a consistent pattern of Marika making others do her dirty work. Malekith is the one who confronts the Glomide Queen. Godfrey is the one who faces down the Storm King. And Radagon is the one leading the army into Liurnia. Despite her power, Marika is never once shown to fight directly, and Radagon, among other things, is the more martial half of the god. So if there were giants to slay, Radagon was the one doing it, alongside Godfrey. Given just how important this war was for protecting the nascent Erd Tree and establishing the Golden Order, it would be pretty shocking if Radagon wasn't fighting. And secondly, there is the description of the giant's red braid, which says, "Every giant is red of hair, and Radagon was said to have despised his own red locks. Perhaps that was a curse of their kind." Clearly there's some association being made between Radagon and giants. But in English, there are two natural readings of this, because of the ambiguous scope of the phrase, "their kind." It could mean that the giants cursed Radagon, or it could mean that Radagon is himself a giant, or part giant, and that the red hair is a curse of their kind, including him. Here, the Japanese is helpful, because instead of the ambiguous pronoun, it restates the subject. So the more direct translation is, perhaps it was a curse of the giants. The point is, the item is suggesting that giants might have cursed Radagon in particular. And it could be wrong, by the way. This questioning tone is common among Elden Ring items, and usually implies that this is a rumor that is commonly believed, whether or not it is true. Still, why would there be a common belief that the giants specifically cursed Radagon, unless he was actively involved in slaying them? Okay, but what about the very center of the lands between? While we're talking about duality, the other very common question I got was about my claim that the Realm of Shadow and the lands between are physically separate, and have been for a long time. I made a whole separate video about this, so I'm not going to get into the details of that debate here, but I will clarify for the purpose of the Grand Unified Theory that the actual location of the Realm of Shadow doesn't really matter. What matters is that it is a realm that represents the lost and buried history that the Golden Order derives from. We also know that it's a realm connected to death, to spirits, and to the energy of the Crucible, all of which are points explicitly and repeatedly made by the game. The specific nature of the separation of these lands, however, is open to interpretation. There is one other detail about the Realm of Shadow that frequently gets misunderstood that I'll quickly address. The suppressing pillar is often thought to be somehow involved in suppressing the land itself and separating it from the lands between. However, the Japanese name for this object, Shizume no Hashira, could instead be translated as the calming pillar or pacifying pillar. Given the context of the phrase, all manners of death, this pillar might have nothing to do with suppressing the land, and instead have something to do with calming the emotions of the dead who reside here. Storm King has mentioned an idea very like this in a recent video, and notes that the pillar architecturally seems to date to the ancient dynasty, long before the Golden Order. There is definitely a lot of room for nuanced interpretations of this pillar and its purpose, and I encourage people to continue thinking about this one. Let's move on and readdress Gnosticism. In my Vision and Cosmology episode, I called Gnosticism an old religion, and said that it was eventually deemed heretical by the nascent Catholic Church. I got some understandable pushback in the comments and wanted to provide some clarification. Firstly, a quick refresher. We're talking about a set of ideas that were ascribed to by some early proto-Christian groups, that the material world was a flawed creation from the very beginning, a creation of a false god called the Demiurge. In order to reconnect to divine truth, Gnostics believed that we had to somehow see past and reject the material world. The main problem is me referring to this as a religion called Gnosticism. The reality is that the term was created later to describe a series of ideas that were ascribed to by disparate groups that never quite solidified into an organized religion. Meanwhile, the idea that the creation of the world was done by a false god is pretty deeply heretical in most religions. I wanted to get the basic idea across and move on, but should have expected my audience to be versed in these topics, and I do respect a demand for rigor, thus clarification. Of course, this doesn't change our analysis of Elden Ring. The purpose of bringing up Gnostic ideas when analyzing Elden Ring, or Evangelion for that matter, isn't to promote a religious ideology, but to get at the underlying anxiety that Gnosticism itself is responding to, and to confront that head on. We live in a world with great suffering, and we can acutely feel the great gap between ourselves and other people. Can we ever close that gap? Can we ever reach a deeper truth beyond the limits of the physical world? This genre of anxiety repeatedly recurs in Elden Ring, and the divine forces of the world seem to present many different answers to this question. But with that clarification out of the way, let's move on to discuss mistranslation. I've brought up translation in the context of Elden Ring, which is interesting both as a practical aspect of the game's development and as a theme the game is exploring. The game is clearly interested in translation as a concept, as divine purpose is translated to us from the subtle motion of the fingers, which in turn, we learn has already gone through multiple layers of transmission and interpretation. This is a topic that I think the game is actively exploring, and this informs how we should think about translation of the game itself, especially the English translation. However, upon reflection, I do think I can be much more precise about what I mean here. In my Vision and Cosmology episode, I said that mistranslation is an intentional part of the process of the game, and that's a dangerous way for me to word this point. I certainly do not mean to say that the translation team is trying to trick us, or that thinking more carefully about the translation is ultimately futile. Rather, what I mean is that ideas warping in translation is unavoidable, and in Elden Ring, I think this unavoidable reality has been worked into the themes and narrative of the game itself. So, a few quick notes about that. Firstly, as I reiterate in my World Turns Upside Down video, there is a real difference between the English translation of Elden Ring and every other non-English translation. There was quite simply more effort and more resources dedicated to the English translation, as is attested to in numerous interviews. And this makes sense when the game was always intended to have exclusively English voice acting, and a famous English writer collaborating on world building. But I think there's more to it than that. Miyazaki talked to George R.R. Martin about major themes and ideas they wanted to include, but then encouraged him to take those themes and write a world-building document all on his own, in English. After Martin was done, Miyazaki took that document as a starting point, and in one interview prior to the game's release, seems very excited by the idea of Martin getting to discover just how thoroughly his characters have been twisted into monstrous versions of themselves. In other words, the relationship between the original conceit written by Martin and the version of the Lands Between we see in-game was very intentional from the start. Miyazaki always intended to have fresh source material written in English and then to distort it into the lore we see in-game. I think that from the beginning, Miyazaki wanted to work the theme of a divine plan getting lost in translation into the actual process of making the game, so that its appearance as a major theme within the game would be as organic as possible. Now, if you're not a big fan of meta-narrative allegory, then the point to take away from all of that is that within the story of Elden Ring, the Greater Will, the Outer Gods, and all other divine forces are definitely, without a doubt, communicating in a language that mortals don't understand, and that always gets distorted by the time it becomes manifested in the world. The great irony of Elden Ring's world building is that mortals are eternally reaching toward the divine in hopes of changing the world, and yet it is only through a flawed, mortal perspective that divinity can ever enter reality and have sway. This interplay causes the world itself to constantly twist and distort to better conform to some perfect vision that by its very nature cannot be conceived of by anyone, mortal or divine. And all of that sets us up pretty nicely for the real punchline of Gut Check, namely, what exactly is the Grand Unified Theory? In my other videos, I make a series of connections that build up to a larger thesis, but since I spend so much time talking around the punchline, I can understand if you left the series still uncertain exactly what the Grand Unified Theory is. So here I'm going to give a few clarifications, and then get straight to the point with the most concise version of it I can muster. First clarification. I believe that my interpretation can inform both our understanding of themes and literal lore. If it feels like I spend too much time thinking about allegory, keep in mind that Elden Ring has a clear and consistent pattern of taking metaphors and making them literal within its world. So identifying themes leads us directly to narrative connections. Second clarification. I use the words interpretation and lens frequently because the starting point of this theory is to identify what I think the story of Elden Ring is fundamentally about, the deepest, most centrally important themes, and then to look at the rest of the lore and see how it connects to this core. So then, what is the conceptual core of Elden Ring? For me, it's two ideas and how they interact. First is the relationship of unity and division. Specifically, division is the action that creates the mortal world and individuality within Elden Ring, while unification brings mortals closer to the divine. The One Great is the most unified and most divine state of the world, and as it divided countless times, it created the Lands Between as we see it. Meanwhile, as individuals unite and merge, they gradually become more divine. This is causality and regression, the two forces that are constantly interacting to create the world. The second core idea is the impossibility of perfect translation, and specifically, the impossibility of interpreting divine will. The game begins with you being given divine guidance in the form of the light of grace, and the further you follow that thread, the more layers of obscurity you find between yourself and the divine will you are supposedly serving. The long absence of the greater will from the Lands Between is a fact that only becomes more and more clear the deeper you delve into the game and its DLC. And this synergizes with the first core idea, because the distance between the divine and mortal perspectives is made clear by the path that leads between them, either dividing consciousness countless times to create individual perspectives, or, going the other way, merging individuals together and obliterating their individuality to attain the perspective of a god. These two genres of perspective, the mortal and divine, are categorically incompatible, and thus divine will must travel through countless layers of interpretation and translation as it winds its way down through light, falling stars, and semi-divine messengers to reach the mortal world. This is the lens I began with, and with that lens in mind, we can identify major thematic threads, which in turn lead us to understand the actual lore more clearly. One of the best examples of this is the Rebis thematic. Upon a first playthrough of Elden Ring, the reveal that Marika and Radagon are the same person might feel like a dramatic, but ultimately random bit of information. And yet the game clearly considers this one of the most important reveals in its story. If we consider the importance of unity and division, however, and the alchemical thematics in Elden Ring, the union of man and woman into a single higher being is an unmistakable image of a Rebis. Within alchemy itself, this male-female unity is mostly symbolic of the idea of unifying opposing elements, but within Elden Ring, it could not be more literal, and helps us to identify that Marika's divinity is founded upon her being more than one person. This idea is expanded upon in the DLC, where we discover that shamans all have an uncommon ability to merge with the flesh of others, and were being used ritualistically by the Hornsent to merge individuals together. This is a recurring image, and we find numerous factions throughout the world of Elden Ring trying to imitate or approach divinity by unifying individuals together. So let's pull this thread and expand on some of the big picture connections. Firstly, twins. This division and unity core idea allows us to more explicitly answer the question I asked at the beginning of my Duality episode. Why are there so many twins in Elden Ring? The answer is that if all of creation occurs through division, then twins are pieces of reality that are freshly severed, pieces that still fit together. They form a sort of bridge between the forces of causality and regression, because they are simultaneously individuals and parts of a unified whole when considered with their other half. This language comes up frequently in descriptions of twins within the game. For instance, Relana's twin blades, not to be confused with twin blades, says, Carrion light greatsword, embedded with blue glintstone, weapon of Renala, the Twin Moon Knight, 2 swords as a single armament. The description uses the singular form, and describes this as a single weapon, which is composed of 2 swords. In twin blades, not to be confused with twin blades, this relationship is even more clear, as the 2 blades are attached at the handle. Dee's weapon, the inseparable sword, goes even further. It is a sword made by compounding silver and gold, and says, the inseparable twins found solace in the Golden Order, the only institution not to revile them as accursed beings. Again, in the context of the Rebis thematic, the idea that the Golden Order values the unification of opposites makes sense. Meanwhile, other cultures might perceive twins as not fully separated individuals, and therefore cursed. Incidentally, there are historical, real-world cultures that also considered twins cursed, so, as usual, Elden Ring is building off of real-world ideas. Also note that twinhood can be layered. For example, Melania and Mikola are twins, but Mikola also has his other half in the form of Saint Trina. The more divine a being is, the more times they can be divided to form separate perspectives. While twins naturally thread the needle between divided and unified identities, one can also create this balance through ritualistic union, aka marriage. This is why the game puts so much emphasis on consorts. Through a divine union, 2 individuals become more than the sum of their parts, able to transcend their individual perspectives and jointly invoke the forces of creation. Speaking of which, let's talk about divine language. My very first claim was that golden runes are part of a divine, world-making language. I then claimed that great runes could only be born by demigods, because they were each, in some sense, more than one person. Now that we have a fuller picture, let's look at that idea again. Firstly, I assume that it's pretty clear by now why I'm claiming that the demigods are each more than one person. But just to seal the deal, consider how often this imagery specifically comes up with them. Godric, the very first demigod most players encounter, has the most inelegant and brute force version of this thematic on display, in the form of grafting. He is desperately trying to elevate himself by attaching as many body parts to himself as possible. Rykard has not only merged himself with a snake, but has in turn consumed countless mortals who make up the combined Serpent King, and he invites you to join him as family. How nice. Melania and Mikola are not only twins, but we see each of them divide into multiple people. Melania creates her buds in the form of Millicent and her sisters, while Mikola also contains Saint Trina. We fight Morgott and Moog twice each, because they can each create duplicates of themselves. Rani, despite giving up her Empyrean flesh, is still visually depicted as having 2 faces and more than a typical number of arms. The specifics vary, but the theme is abundantly repeated. So consider this in the context of divine and mortal perspective. Unification of individuals gives you a more divine perspective by allowing you to see from multiple perspectives at once. If the world of Elden Ring is foundationally made up of a divine language, then a demigod or other divine being can see this divine language from multiple perspectives at once. They can perceive great runes and the Elden Ring itself in a way that mortals cannot, because we are limited by our individuality. To understand this, imagine trying to describe a 4-dimensional object, like a tesseract, to a 3-dimensional creature, like a human. We can try to understand a 4-dimensional object through analogy, through logical representation, or through symbolic rendering, but we can never truly see an object in 4 dimensions. Same thing would be true for a 2-dimensional creature trying to understand a 3-dimensional object. In essence, I am suggesting that the Elden Ring is akin to, or perhaps literally is, a higher dimensional object, and that the flat 2-dimensional image we see of it in-game is only a representation of it from the perspective of a mortal. Marika's eyes being closed can be understood to suggest that she is looking inward, and what is within her is the Elden Ring itself. This is the vision she is perceiving and then spreading to the world around her through the emanated light of the Erd Tree, a vision of a deathless world made manifest. There is, however, a great flaw in the Golden Order, and that is found in Marika herself, because she simultaneously has the perspective of a godlike being and the subjective perspective of a mortal. This fact has been glossed over by the churches and dogma of the Lands Between, but the game makes it more and more clear as we progress and explore. Marika is a person, and she is unable to fully let go of her own past, her trauma, her love. Her own fears are being woven into the fabric of the world, which is seen most clearly in the banishment of destined death, an essential part of reality that she simply refuses to look at. This is what makes Mikola such a strong foil for Marika, because he comes to understand all of this, and sees that the world can never truly heal while it is built upon the guilt and fear of a person. He aims to do things differently, and concludes that he must shed all of the things that make up his biased and individual perspective. I abandon here my doubt and vacillation. I abandon here all of my fears. I abandon here my love. These are the words Mikola leaves behind after he has abandoned his flesh and continues shedding parts of himself until the only thing left is divine, the unbiased, unfearing Godhead that can create a more perfect order. What Miquella and Marika both fail to understand is that a perfect and eternal order is less than the world can and should be. This deep longing for the divine and the perfect blinds the inhabitants of the lands between to the miraculous beauty of mortality. Transformation, change, death, and rebirth are the domain of the imperfect, and yet they hold a power just as great as the grace of gold. Perhaps the greatest power of all is the power individuals have to choose to care about something for no particular reason. This is what makes the stories of Dialos, Bach, and Roderica resonate with us so strongly. They each need to unlearn the importance of strength and forgive themselves for being compassionate. Elden Ring takes our most mythical tales about strength and godlike power and shows us how terrifying a world these forces actually make. It is in the face of the seemingly relentless struggle for power that we see most clearly how important quiet beauty and acceptance truly are. Even in the midst of the most flawed creation, there is room for us to invest ourselves into the world, rather than divest ourselves from it. To choose to embrace our mortal perspective and the quirks and flaws of our world. And I've chosen to embrace my own quirky, personal perspective on Elden Ring itself, and to see just how much meaning I can find within it. Because that sure sounds better than losing myself in the search for an objective or divine perspective. The last point I want to make about the Grand Unified Theory is that it was never meant to be the end of the discussion on Elden Ring's lore. I consider the theory complete in the sense that I have fully outlined the interpretive lens I'm using and demonstrated just how many elements of the game connect elegantly together when viewed through this lens. I have not, however, exhausted all of the topics that could be analyzed through this lens, and I encourage you to take from the gut whatever concepts are most useful to you in your own understanding of the lore. I made this series to enrich our ability to engage with an enigmatic story, after all, and I believe that Elden Ring is a game about perspective, and how different people can look upon the same thing and see it differently. So, I'm not going to insist that my interpretation is the only valid reading of the story of Elden Ring. I do think it's a very good one, though. I always assumed that these ideas would gradually enter the discourse around the game and mingle with other theories. Over the last year, I have gotten to see a handful of videos that do build upon themes I've raised, and particularly wanted to give a nod to Consecrated Lorefield. They've mentioned, for example, an idea that connects to one I raised just a minute ago, that there is a parallel between Miquella shedding his doubt and vacillation, and the greater will breaking apart the One Great and separating out the frenzied flame, now a separate entity that carries the doubt and vacillation that lingers from the creation of all things. It's quite an elegant parallel, and their debut video is definitely worth a watch. I also appreciated getting to see the live reaction of Last Protagonist to my videos, even though I'm sure he doesn't agree with me about everything, and watching someone watch my video was a surreal experience. It's still extremely valuable to see someone's live thought process while engaging with my own theories. And more recently, I've been engaged in a variety of conversations on Discord that are giving me ongoing inspiration for new videos. So I want to thank everyone who has participated either there or in the comments. Some of you have written me whole master's theses, and I, for one, always welcome new ideas and appreciate seeing how much we're capable of inspiring in each other. In addition to the Grand Unified Theory, I also have videos on side topics within Elden Ring's lore, called Between Meanings, and I will soon add to that collection with an Ancient Dragons episode. I have also broadened this channel to talk about other games that benefit from a philosophical lens. So, for example, if you just heard about how Clair Obscur swept the Game Awards, then now is as good a time as any to try it out and watch my act-by-act analysis along the way. I intend to talk about a variety of games and stories, but will regularly return to Elden Ring, as there are endless topics to analyze within it. I want to thank everyone who has engaged with and supported this channel, especially when it was just getting off the ground. A year ago, I wasn't sure how much time I could afford to spend on making video essays, and I quite like being in the future where I completed the Grand Unified Theory and then continued making content afterward. If you also like being in this future, you can support the channel on Patreon, and it always helps to like, comment, share, and to name drop me in your own masterpiece. Thank you for watching, and make sure to grab the algorithm by the shoulders, stare into its eyes, and tell it that this is some engaging content. Until next time.